There are nights when the sky feels like it's been painted with whispers, and those whispers find their way into the quietest corners of the world. Rick didn't always understand the silence that surrounded him, the stillness that felt more like a weight than a comfort. In his early years, it seemed as though the world simply didn't want to acknowledge his presence. He would wander through the days, his mind a maze of thoughts he couldn't quite unravel, and his heart holding a quiet ache that no one seemed to notice. The town where he grew up was small, too small for most people's taste, tucked away on the edge of the world, as if it were an afterthought of time. The sort of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the rhythm of life pulsed with familiarity. Yet for Rick, it often felt like he was a stranger to it, though it was the only place he knew. The houses, with their neat gardens and picket fences, seemed to be more like sculptures than homes, standing still and waiting for something that would never come. It wasn't the kind of place you expected anything strange to happen. But then again, what if strange things weren't meant to announce themselves? What if they waited quietly like the earth before a storm? Rick had always been a little different, but it wasn't something he fully understood. There were moments, tiny insignificant moments, where things seemed off. His mind would race, 1,000 thoughts flashing like the stars at midnight, but they would disappear just as quickly. Sometimes he could swear he heard voices, faint whispers on the wind, or saw shadows darting in the corner of his eye, never staying long enough to fully grasp. But when he looked around, no one else seemed to notice. He felt the weight of these small mysteries like a quiet pressure against his chest. One afternoon when he was about 10, he found something strange, or perhaps it found him. It was the old oak tree near the edge of the forest, a place he often visited when he wanted to escape the noise of the world. The tree had been there as long as anyone could remember, its twisted branches reaching out like arms, cradling the sky. That day the wind was particularly still, and the air felt thick, almost like it was holding its breath. Rick stood there, staring at the gnarled roots that twisted around the base of the tree. Something about them seemed to call to him, urging him to step closer. He hesitated, unsure of what was pulling him toward it, but his feet moved before his mind could stop them. As he knelt down to inspect the roots, he noticed something strange. A small stone, barely the size of his palm, wedged between the roots. It was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and when he picked it up, it felt warm against his skin, as though it had been waiting for him. He turned the stone over in his hands, feeling an inexplicable sense of calm wash over him, as if the world for just a moment had made sense. But as quickly as it came, the feeling faded, leaving him with only the stone in his hand and a vague sense of something lost. He didn't understand why, but he knew that the stone was important, that it held a secret, one that was far bigger than anything he could comprehend at that moment. Rick pocketed the stone and left the tree behind, but it wasn't the last time it would call to him. The next few weeks were like a blur. Rick couldn't stop thinking about the stone, about the way it had made him feel. He had no idea what it meant, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was shifting, something that had always been there but was now waking up inside him. He didn't tell anyone about the stone, not his parents, not his friends. It felt too personal, too strange to explain. And yet, as the days passed, things began to change around him. Small things at first. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, something strange happened. His mother, who was always so busy with the housework, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes, usually soft and distracted, seemed to focus on him with an intensity that sent a chill up his spine. She didn't say anything, just watched him as though trying to see something she couldn't quite reach. Rick felt his heart race, and for a moment he thought she might say something, ask him about the stone or about the strange things he had been feeling. But instead she turned away, her gaze drifting back to the dishes. It was as if the moment had never happened. But it had, and it lingered in the air between them, as if the world itself had held its breath just for that brief moment. In the days that followed, the whispers began again. They were faint at first, just murmurs in the wind, but they seemed to follow him wherever he went. He tried to ignore them, but it wasn't easy. They were like an itch he couldn't scratch, a quiet presence he couldn't escape. And then, one night, as he lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, the whispers grew louder. They didn't speak words he could understand, but their rhythm, the cadence of their voices, felt familiar, like a song he had heard long ago, but could never quite remember. It was in that moment that Rick knew something was happening. Something bigger than he could grasp, something that had been waiting for him all along. The stone in his pocket pulsed gently, as if in response to the rising tide of thoughts and emotions within him. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that he couldn't ignore it anymore. The world outside seemed to quiet, as if it too had grown aware of what was unfolding. The whispers were growing louder, and Rick felt a strange pull, one he couldn't explain yet couldn't resist. Before he could fully understand what was happening, the room around him seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves had softened. The stillness grew deeper, richer, as though the entire world had closed its eyes and taken a breath. Rick knew then that something had changed. Something was waiting. And though he didn't know where this path would lead, he knew he had to follow it. The whispers, the stone, the strange feeling in his chest, they all pointed in one direction. The question wasn't what was happening. The question was when. And Rick had no choice but to find out. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into something unknown, but it wasn't frightening. Not exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you're drifting off to sleep, just before the world of dreams fully embraces you. That strange, suspended moment when time seems to hold its breath. Rick went through the motions of his days, but everything felt different now. The whispers still echoed in his mind, and the stone in his pocket felt warmer each time he touched it. The stone, he had come to realize, wasn't just a rock. It was something more. Something alive in a way that he couldn't explain. It pulsed with an energy that seemed to resonate with his very thoughts. The longer he carried it, the more he felt connected to it, as though it was attuned to him, and he to it. Sometimes when the world around him grew quiet enough, he could almost hear it, a faint hum like the vibration of a distant string. He tried to ignore it, but there was no escaping its pull. One evening, after the sun had slipped below the horizon, he found himself walking toward the oak tree again. His steps felt as though they were guided by something unseen, and the moment he arrived, he knew that this place, this tree, was where it all began. But what was it? What was the connection between the stone, the whispers, and this quiet corner of the world? The tree loomed before him, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms, beckoning him closer. He reached into his pocket and took out the stone, feeling its warmth grow as his fingers brushed against it. It was as if it were urging him to do something he didn't understand but felt with every part of him. He stood there for a long time, staring at the tree, until something stirred in the air. The wind, which had been still for days, picked up, rustling the leaves in a soft, whispering symphony. It felt different. The air seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere had changed, just for him. And then, from somewhere deep within, the roots of the oak, a voice spoke. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a sensation, a vibration in the air that Rick could feel in his bones. The voice was not human, but it wasn't alien either. It felt old, wise, and terribly familiar. "You've come at last." Rick's heart skipped a beat. He knew without a doubt that the voice was speaking to him. But how could it know? How could anything know? The stone in his hand warmed even further, and the voice seemed to pulse with it, growing stronger. "It's time for you to remember," the voice said. "The stone is a key. It will guide you if you trust it." The words were simple, but they hung in the air like a weight. He didn't understand what it meant, but something deep inside him did. It was as if the voice was speaking to a part of him that had been buried, forgotten, waiting to awaken. Rick closed his eyes and took a deep breath, holding the stone tightly in his hand. The whispers had grown louder, now swirling around him, like a soft storm. It was overwhelming yet soothing at the same time, and suddenly, without warning, he felt it, the shift. The world around him seemed to bend, just for a moment, like a ripple in water. His body tingled, and when he opened his eyes, the world looked different. The shadows stretched longer, the colors seemed deeper, and the stars above, those faint, distant lights, felt so much closer. For a brief instant, Rick felt as though he could reach out and touch them, as though he were part of something vast and unexplainable. The voice continued, but now it wasn't just in the air. It was inside him, moving through his veins, vibrating. So against his skin. The path is before you, Rick. You must walk it, but remember, every step you take alone. The words felt like a truth, a deep truth that had always existed, waiting for him to discover it. And in that moment, he understood. It wasn't the stone that was important. It was the journey, the discovery of himself, that had always been the purpose. He stood there for a long time, letting the sensations wash over him. When he finally looked down, he saw something, a symbol etched into the bark of the oak tree, glowing faintly with the same warmth as the stone. The symbol was simple, circular, with lines radiating outward like the sun. It was a pattern he recognized from his dreams, though he had never seen it before. Somehow he knew it was a sign. Rick reached out, his fingers grazing the bark. The moment he touched it, a shock ran through him, not painful, but electric, like a spark of recognition. It was as though the tree was communicating with him, and in some small way he could feel its thoughts. Or perhaps it was his thoughts intertwining with the trees. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The world became still again, and Rick's senses sharpened. It was as if the voice had faded into the background, leaving him with a quiet, unspoken understanding. He turned away from the tree and started to walk back toward home. The night seemed deeper now, as though he were walking through a different world, one that had always been there but was hidden behind the veil of the ordinary. As he walked, Rick's mind raced. What had just happened? What had the voice meant? By "you take it alone." Was it warning him, or was it simply a fact of life? He didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, but it also felt strangely comforting, like an old friend whose presence he didn't fully understand, but whose company was nonetheless familiar. The stone was still warm in his pocket, pulsing softly, a reminder of the mystery that lay ahead. It was clear now that his journey had begun, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he felt the certainty of one thing: he couldn't turn back. The path had chosen him, and he had no choice but to follow it, wherever it might go, as he reached his home. The soft glow of the porch light seemed welcoming, almost as though it had been waiting for him too. But inside, everything felt unchanged. His parents were sitting at the kitchen table, talking quietly, as they always did, at this hour. The world inside felt as it always had, quiet, still, and distant. But Rick knew now that he was no longer the same. And the world, too, had shifted ever so slightly. He sat down at his desk and placed the stone gently on the surface, staring at it for a long time. The room around him was still, but his mind was alive with questions. The stone held the answers. He was certain of that. The voice, the tree, the symbol, they were all pieces of something bigger, but what and how? The answers were just out of reach, but he could feel them tugging at the edges of his thoughts. For the first time in his life, Rick felt like he was on the edge of something important, something that would change everything. And though he couldn't yet see the whole picture, he knew he would soon enough. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of the world Rick had known. Every step he took seemed to echo with the knowledge that something had changed, though the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else. The stone in his pocket had become an extension of himself, warm and pulsing with a quiet energy. He no longer thought of it as just a thing, an object. It had become his, something that seemed to be tied to him in a way that went beyond understanding. But the deeper he delved into it, the more he realized how much he had yet to learn. It was late afternoon when Rick found himself in the garden, watching the light shift across the small patch of grass, where the flowers bloomed with quiet grace. The house was peaceful, his parents away on errands, and the silence gave him the space to think. The whispers, too, had quieted, though they never fully left. Now they lingered in the background of his mind like a distant hum, ever present, though less demanding than before. But the pull of the stone, the tree, the symbols, it all lingered just beneath the surface of his thoughts. He sat on the edge of the garden wall, legs dangling, and thought back to the oak tree, to the voice that had spoken to him with such certainty. "You take it alone," it had said. What did that mean? Was he being warned, or was it a simple statement of fact? The more he pondered it, the more he felt as though the answer was just beyond his reach. It was like trying to recall a dream just after waking, familiar but slipping through his fingers. A small breeze stirred the air, and Rick pulled the stone from his pocket, holding it in his palm. It warmed immediately, like a pulse beating. Within his hand, he stared at it, wondering if it would give him more answers now. It had been quiet for the past few days, as if it too were waiting for something. For him, perhaps. The light of the late afternoon sun caught the edges of the stone, casting soft shadows across the smooth surface. For a moment it looked almost alive, like it was waiting to tell him something, something he didn't yet understand. Rick closed his eyes, listening to the world around him. The sound of birds in the trees, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, everything felt normal. Yet deep inside he knew it wasn't. There was something greater unfolding around him, something he couldn't quite grasp, but felt in every fiber of his being. And that feeling was growing, drawing him toward a destination he couldn't see but could sense with an urgency that quickened the rhythm of his pulse. The stone felt warmer now, almost too warm to hold. Without thinking, he stood up and walked toward the garden gate, the stone still clutched in his hand. He didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. The path before him had already begun to form in his mind, though he couldn't yet see its end. All he knew was that he needed to follow it, to follow. As he walked, his mind drifted to the oak tree again. The whispering voice, the symbol etched into the bark. There was something important there, something that had connected him to this strange, shifting world. But what was it? What was the true meaning of the symbol, of the stone? When he reached the edge of the forest, Rick stopped. The trees stood like silent sentinels before him, their shadows stretching long into the fading light. He had walked this path many times before, but now it felt different, as if the very earth beneath him was welcoming him into something new. The whispers were louder now, but they weren't as confusing as before. There was clarity in them, a sense of purpose. He could almost hear them as words, though they were still too faint to fully understand. He stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet pull of the forest around him. Then, as if compelled by something deep within, he took a step forward. The moment his foot touched the forest floor, the air seemed to shift. The world around him felt sharper. The colors, the sounds, everything seemed to gain a deeper clarity, as though the veil between his world and something else had lifted, just a little. The whispers became clearer now, and though they still lacked words, there was meaning in their rhythm. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he understood that the voices were guiding him, leading him forward. Rick walked deeper into the forest, his steps slow but steady. Each footfall seemed to reverberate through the stillness, sending ripples into the quiet air. The deeper he went, the more he felt that the forest was alive, that it was watching him, waiting for him. It wasn't frightening, it was welcoming. He had the strangest feeling that the trees, the earth, even the air, had been waiting for him to arrive. And now that he was here, they were all part of something that was just beginning to unfold. Eventually, he came to a clearing. The trees parted just enough to let a shaft of sunlight break through, casting a soft glow on the forest floor. In the center of the clearing stood another oak tree, larger than the one near his house, its branches stretching high into the sky. This one felt different, though, more ancient, more powerful. Rick's heart skipped a beat as he approached the tree. The air here felt thicker, as though it held something beyond the physical. As he stepped closer, the stone in his hand pulsed, again its warmth growing stronger, almost as if it were alive. He could feel the connection between the tree and the stone, something deep and ancient, something that had always been there but was now waking up. Without thinking, he pressed his palm to the bark of the oak tree. The moment he did, something shifted. The ground beneath his feet trembled ever so slightly, and the whispers rose to a crescendo, as if the very earth was speaking to him. His mind swirled with images, flashes of memories that weren't his, scenes from a world he didn't recognize. He saw a figure, a face half-remembered, and then a symbol, the same one he had seen on the tree near his house, glowing with a faint light. And then, just as quickly, everything stopped. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Rick stepped back, his heart racing, but his mind clearer than it had ever been before. He knew now that the path ahead of him was far from simple. It wasn't just about the stone or the trees or even the whispers. It was about something much bigger, something that had been waiting for him all along. He looked around the clearing, his eyes scanning the trees, the sky, the earth beneath his feet. There was something here, something he hadn't yet seen, but he could feel it pulling him forward. And so, with the stone still warm in his hand and the whispers still echoing in his mind, Rick knew what he had to do. He had to keep moving, keep walking, toward whatever lay ahead. Rick stood there for a long time, his fingers still pressing against the bark of the ancient oak. The whispers had faded once again, replaced by a profound stillness that wrapped around him like a thick, comforting blanket. He could feel the pulse of the stone in his pocket, a gentle rhythm that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. It was as if the tree, the stone, and the world around him had become one, a single entity that understood him in ways no one ever had. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, the coolness of it grounding him, connecting him to the earth beneath his feet. The stillness was almost sacred, and yet there was a quiet anticipation in the air, a sense that something was about to happen, something that had been set into motion the moment he had touched the tree. Rick stepped back, his gaze lingering on the tree before him. Its bark was rough under his fingers, its branches reaching up like arms that held the sky itself. There was a quiet wisdom in its presence, a silent understanding that he couldn't quite put into words. But somehow in this moment, he knew. It was guiding him, waiting for him to take the next step. The forest around him was unchanged, silent, still, as if holding its breath. But Rick felt different. It wasn't just the weight of the stone in his pocket, or the whispers that still echoed faintly in his mind. No, something deeper had shifted. It was as if the very fabric of the world around him had rippled, pulling him into a new reality, a world where things made sense in a way they never had before. Everything felt connected now, the stone, the tree, the whispers, and the quiet rhythm of his own heart. And then, just as the realization began to settle in, the ground beneath his feet trembled again. This time it was stronger, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. Rick's heart skipped a beat, and he looked around, his senses alert. The trees swayed slightly, their branches creaking in the wind. But there was no storm, no lightning. It was as if the earth itself was speaking, calling out to him, urging him to listen. The stone in his pocket warmed, almost too hot to touch, and Rick's fingers twitched involuntarily. He reached for it, pulling it from his pocket with a sense of urgency he couldn't explain. The moment the stone made contact with his skin, a surge of energy coursed through him. Not painful, but electric, like a bolt of lightning racing through his veins. He gasped, the world around him blurring for a moment, before everything snapped back into focus. It was then that Rick realized the stone wasn't just a thing he could hold. It was a conduit, a link between himself and something much larger than he could comprehend. The stone had always been there, guiding him, but it had never felt this alive before. It had always been a part of him, waiting for him to reach the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. The whispers returned louder than ever, though they weren't words. They were sensations, feelings, images that flashed through his mind in rapid succession. He saw the symbol again, glowing faintly in the darkness. He saw the oak tree, the one near his house, and then he saw something else, a face half remembered like a shadow in his thoughts. It was there but not there, a figure that seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. Rick's breath caught in his throat, and the stone pulsed once more, its warmth growing as if it were alive. The face, the symbol, the tree. It was all connected. But how? What did it mean? He didn't know, but he could feel the answers were close, just out of reach, waiting for him to discover them. His eyes widened as the ground beneath him trembled again, this time more violently. The earth seemed to groan, and the trees around him shook as if something deep within the forest was stirring. He looked around, his heart racing, but there was no sign of danger. It was as if the forest itself was alive, awakening from a long slumber, responding to the energy that had been released. The air grew thick, charged with an electric tension that seemed to hum with possibility. Rick stepped back, his legs unsteady beneath him. The stone still pulsed in his hand, but now it felt different, like it was calling to him. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the clearing, looking for something, anything that would explain what was happening. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the trees, there was a faint glow, like the soft light of the moon reflecting off something shiny. It was coming from deeper within the forest, past where the trees grew thickest, where the shadows were darkest. The glow pulsed in time with the rhythm of the stone, and Rick knew without a doubt that this was the next step in his journey. This was what he had been waiting for. Without thinking, he started walking, his feet carrying him toward the glow, the whispers growing louder in his mind. The air around him seemed to thicken, to hum with energy, as if the forest itself was urging him forward. The ground trembled beneath his feet, but it was no longer frightening. It was as if the earth was alive, moving with him, guiding him toward something that he couldn't yet understand, but was destined to find. The deeper he went into the forest, the stronger the pull became. The glow grew brighter, casting long shadows that danced like living things in the trees. Rick could feel it now, the connection between the stone, the whispers, the glow, and the forest. It was all tied together, a web of energy and knowledge that had been waiting for him to discover. And now he was ready to uncover it. As he approached the source of the light, Rick's breath caught in his throat. The glow was coming from a small pool of water nestled in the heart of the forest. The water shimmered, reflecting the light, like a mirror, but there was something strange about it. The surface of the water wasn't still. It rippled and shifted, as though it was alive, moving with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the stone in his hand. Rick stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pull, the need to understand, to discover the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. The stone in his hand grew warm, almost too hot to touch, and Rick knew that this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He knelt beside the pool, the water rippling as if responding to his presence. He held the stone over the water, his fingers trembling with anticipation. And then, as if by some unseen force, the stone began to glow, matching the light of the pool, pulsing with energy. The whispers filled his mind again, clearer now, no longer distant or disjointed. They spoke to him, not in words but in images, in feelings. He saw the face again, that same half-remembered face, and he saw something else. A symbol etched into the water, glowing with the same light as the stone. Rick didn't understand it all, but he felt the answer, deep in his bones. This was the beginning of something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. The stone, the tree, the whispers, the water, they were all part of a puzzle, one that he was meant to solve. And so, with a deep breath, Rick let the stone fall into the shimmering water, watching as it sank below the surface, its light fading into the depths. And with it, he felt a part of himself sink away, too, a part of him that had been waiting to be freed. For the first time in his life, Rick understood. This was only the beginning. The world around Rick seemed to hold its breath as the stone sank into the pool. The ripples it caused spread out across the water's surface, stretching toward the edges, before fading into nothingness. For a moment, everything felt still. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, as though the forest, the earth, even the stars above were waiting for something or someone, waiting for him. Rick remained kneeling by the pool, his hand still hovering over the water, though the stone was gone. His heart pounded in his chest, and the whispers that had filled his mind moments before were now silent. The world around him had become impossibly quiet, as if time itself had taken a step back, giving him space to breathe, to reflect. But as he stared at the pool, the surface began to shimmer again. Not in the way it had before, with the soft, glowing light of the stone, but with something else, something deeper, more alive. The water rippled once more, and then, to Rick's astonishment, a figure began to materialize in the depths. At first, it was nothing more than a faint shape, a shadow moving just beneath the surface. But then, as the water settled, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her features were soft, indistinct, as if she were made of the water itself. She seemed to float just beneath the surface, her hair swirling. Like tendrils of smoke, her eyes closed as though in deep contemplation. Her presence felt familiar, though Rick couldn't place why. There was something about her that resonated with him, something he had seen before but couldn't quite remember. The woman opened her eyes slowly, and when she did, it was as though the world itself had shifted. Her gaze was piercing, yet gentle, and it seemed to reach through Rick, pulling him into her. He felt a strange, unexplainable pull, as though her eyes were the key to something he had been searching for all this time. Without thinking, Rick reached out toward the water, his fingers trembling, but before he could touch it, the woman's voice echoed in his mind. It was soft like the rustling of leaves, yet clear as if it were coming from the depths of the water itself. "You've come far, Rick, but the path is not yet clear." Her words sent a shiver through him, though not out of fear. It was something else and something deeper, as though the truth she was speaking was just beyond his grasp, waiting for him to understand. "What path?" Rick whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke aloud for the first time since he had arrived in the forest. "What do you mean?" The woman's lips curled into a soft, knowing smile. "The path you've always been on. The path that brought you here to this moment." Rick's heart raced as her words sank in. The path he had felt tugging at him since he first found the stone. It wasn't just about the stone, or the oak trees, or the whispers. It was about something much greater, something tied to him in a way he didn't yet fully understand. The woman's form seemed to shimmer and fade as she spoke again, her voice more distant this time, as if it were carried on the wind. "The stone you seek is not just a stone. It is part of you, and you are part of it. The answers you seek are not in the world around you, but within yourself. You must find them, Rick, before it is too late." Her voice trailed off, leaving Rick in stunned silence. The water had settled again, and the woman's figure was gone, leaving nothing but the soft ripples in the pool's surface. But Rick could still feel her presence. It lingered in the air in his chest like an unanswered question. "Before it is too late." Her words echoed in his mind over and over again, each time growing more insistent, more urgent. Rick stood there, unmoving, staring at the now still water. His mind raced, processing what had just happened. The woman, her words, the path, it was all connected. But how? What was this path that he was supposed to follow, and what had she meant by "before it is too late"? Too late for what? The weight of it all pressed down on him, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was more like the quiet weight of a secret that had been waiting to be discovered. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. With a deep breath, Rick turned and began to walk away from the pool. The forest around him seemed to shift once again, the shadows deepening as the day began to fade into evening. But this time Rick didn't feel lost. He felt focused, like something had clicked into place within him, something that had been waiting for him to understand. As he walked, he didn't look back at the pool. He didn't need to. He knew the answers were ahead of him, not behind him. The woman in the water had given him a glimpse of the truth, but it was up to him to find the rest. The air was cooler now, the fading light casting long shadows across the path before him. The whispers were quiet again, but they were no longer distant or confusing. They were his own thoughts now, a rhythm he could follow, a guide to what lay ahead. And with every step, the path became clearer, the journey more purposeful. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew that whatever happened, he was ready. The stone in his pocket had led him here, but it was more than just the stone. It was his own heart, his own spirit that was guiding him now. Rick glanced up at the darkening sky. The stars had begun to emerge, faint but steady, like distant beacons on the horizon. They seemed to shine brighter now, as if they too were waiting for him to take the next step. And so, with each step he took, Rick moved forward. Not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in quiet confidence. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he understood that it was his journey to make. The forest seemed different now, not just in the way the shadows stretched across the path, but in the way it felt. The air was thicker, the night deeper, and yet Rick didn't feel alone. He couldn't quite explain why, but with every step, the whispers seemed to grow quieter, more distant, until it was almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. The woman in the pool, her words still echoing in his mind, had given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of clarity, or at least the beginning of it. The answers you seek are not in the world around you, but within yourself, she had said, and now as he walked through the cool, silent woods, he felt that truth more than he understood it. It was a quiet certainty, a quiet knowing that the path ahead wasn't about finding external answers, but about discovering something buried deep within him. The journey, it seemed, was not about the destination. It was about the unfolding of the self. The stars above flickered in the sky, soft pinpricks of light that seemed to guide him. The deeper he went into the woods, the more he realized how little he knew of this place, of the world around him. Yet there was a sense of familiarity, as though he had been here before, even if not in this life, not in this form. Every step felt like it was unlocking something within him. There was a hum in the air now, a subtle vibration in the earth beneath his feet, and it matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The stone that had guided him to this point still burned gently in his pocket, pulsing with quiet power. Rick felt as though the forest was alive, not in a physical sense, but in a way that went deeper. It was aware of him, of his presence, and he in turn was aware of it. The trees, the earth, the air, and they all seemed to be waiting, listening, as if to see what he would do next. And then something shifted. A rustling in the leaves to his left caught his attention, and Rick paused, listening intently. For a moment it was as if the forest itself had held its breath. But no, it wasn't the forest. It was something else. Something human, or something. Close to it. Rick turned, eyes scanning the darkening woods, but there was no one in sight. The rustling had stopped, leaving only the distant call of an owl and the soft chirping of crickets. Yet he knew something had changed. There was a presence here now. Something he couldn't see but could feel, like a shadow just outside the edges of his vision. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He stood still, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. It was as though the forest had exhaled a deep breath, and now everything was perfectly still, perfectly quiet. Rick wasn't sure how long he stood there, but it felt like an eternity. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, filling his chest with an inexplicable heaviness. And then, just when he thought he could no longer stand the stillness, he heard it again, a soft rustling much closer this time. It came from behind him. Rick turned quickly, his heart racing, but there was no one there, just the same trees, the same shadows, the same quiet darkness that stretched on forever, except now something was different, a glimmer, a soft light that flickered in the distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there just beyond the trees, calling to him. Without thinking, Rick began to walk toward it. His feet moved swiftly, but not hurriedly, as though the path itself was urging him on. Each step he took seemed to carry him deeper into the heart of the forest, where the shadows were darker and the air heavier. Yet he didn't feel fear. If anything, he felt drawn to it, to the light, to the mystery that it promised. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, casting long shadows on the forest floor. It wasn't an artificial light, but something softer, something more ethereal. The trees around him seemed to bow toward it, as if paying homage to the glow that now filled the space between them. Rick's heartbeat quickened, the pull growing. Stronger, more urgent. Finally, he stepped into the clearing where the light was coming from. The space was large, but not overwhelmingly so. The glow emanated from a small, circular pool of water, no larger than the one he had seen earlier. The surface of the water shimmered, casting soft reflections on the trees surrounding it, but it was the light itself that drew him in. It was not a natural light, not like the moon or the stars. It was something else, something more ancient, something alive. Rick knelt beside the pool, his fingers trembling as he reached out toward it. The surface rippled as his fingers hovered just above it. and the light seemed to pulse, responding to his presence. There was no sound here, no whispers or calls, only the soft hum of the water and the quiet rustle of the trees. His gaze dropped to the center of the pool. There, just beneath the surface, something gleamed. At first, it seemed like a reflection, a glimmer of something, but then Rick realized, and it wasn't a reflection, it was something real. It was a stone. The same kind of stone that had led him here, the same stone he had cast into the pool near the oak tree. And yet, this one was different. It was larger, glowing with a faint pulsating light that seemed to match the rhythm of his own pulse. Rick's heart raced as he reached for it, but just as his fingers brushed the surface of the water, the light flickered and the stone sank, deeper out of reach. He jerked his hand back, startled, but the light remained, still pulsing, still calling to him. And in the stillness of the forest, he could hear the faintest whisper, as though the forest itself was speaking to him. "You've found it, Rick, but now you must decide. Will you take it, or will you leave it?" The voice was softer this time, not a command, but a question. And Rick knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment when everything he had been searching for would either be revealed or lost forever. His hand hovered above the pool again, and the stone, now barely visible beneath the water, pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The whispers faded away completely, leaving only the sound of his own breath and the steady rhythm of the light. It was time to choose. Rick's hand hovered just above the water, the pulsing light beneath it, beckoning him forward, whispering softly in the back of his mind. The stone, just out of reach, seemed to call to him, its glow faint but steady like a heartbeat of its own. The air around him seemed to hold its breath, the forest silent except for the soft rustling of the trees, as though even the world around him was waiting for his next move. For a moment, Rick stood still, unsure of what to do. He had come so far, had journeyed deeper into the forest than he ever thought possible, and now he stood on the precipice of something that felt almost too big to comprehend. He had seen the woman in the water, had felt the weight of her words, and had come to understand, in the quietest part of himself, that this was the moment when everything he had sought would either unfold or slip through his fingers. He looked down at the water again, his fingers just a breath away from touching the surface. It was so close, yet so far. The stone shimmered below, its glow beckoning him, but there was something else, something deeper about it now. It wasn't just about the stone or the power it held. It was about what it represented. The journey he had taken, the paths he had walked, and the choices he would need to make from here on out. He realized that the stone, like everything else, was part of a much larger story, one that he was only just beginning to understand. The voice, the same one that had spoken to him in the pool by the oak tree, returned, though it was softer this time, almost a whisper in his mind. "You must choose, Rick. The stone is not just an answer, but a question. What will you do with it?" Rick's breath caught in his chest. A question? The stone wasn't just a thing to be found, to be held. It was something more, something that was waiting for him to unlock its true purpose. His fingers brushed against the surface of the water, sending a ripple through the stillness, and the light beneath the water seemed to pulse in response. With a deep breath, Rick reached down and grasped the stone, its warmth flooding his hand as soon as his fingers made contact. For a moment, everything went still. The world, the forest, the air, everything seemed to hold its breath, as though the very act of taking the stone had shifted something deep within the fabric of the world itself. The stone felt alive in his hand, pulsing with energy, its glow brightening as if it were responding to him, to his presence. Rick felt a deep, almost primal connection to it. It was as if the stone had been waiting for him all along, as if it had always known he would come for it. The sense of purpose, of destiny, was overwhelming. And yet, there was still a part of him that was unsure of what came next, unsure of the path that had opened before him. The whispers returned, more insistent now, but they no longer felt distant or confused. They were clear, like a song he had known in another life. They filled his mind, guiding him as if the stone itself was speaking to him, unlocking memories and truths he hadn't even known he had. "You have the stone now, Rick," the voice whispered softly, But it is not just a key, it is a responsibility. You must understand what it means and what you must do with it. Rick closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. Responsibility. It wasn't a word he had expected to hear. The stone was not just a power to be used, not just a tool to be wielded. It was something far deeper, something that tied him to this place, to the journey he had begun, and to whatever lay ahead. With the stone still glowing brightly in his hand, Rick felt a sudden shift in the air around him. The forest seemed to react to it, the trees bending ever so slightly, as if acknowledging the power that had been awakened. The ground beneath him hummed with an energy he hadn't felt before, like a current running through the earth, connecting everything together. The light from the stone began to flicker, as if it were responding to Rick's thoughts, to his understanding of what he had just done. He wasn't sure why, but he knew that holding the stone now wasn't the end of his journey, it was only the beginning. Rick stepped back from the pool, still holding the stone tightly in his hand. His gaze shifted around the clearing, the trees, the shadows growing longer as the night deepened. There was no going back now. He had crossed a threshold, one that led him further into this strange, mysterious world. The path ahead was unclear, and yet it felt like the only one he could follow. For the first time in his life, Rick wasn't afraid. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but he felt the pull of it deep within him. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, he knew that he was ready for it. The whispers grew softer again, almost fading entirely, but the stone in his hand pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat that belonged to the very earth itself. The forest around him seemed to come alive with it, the trees, the air, the ground beneath his feet, all responding to the power he now held. He didn't need the whispers anymore. The stone had given him the clarity he had been searching for. It wasn't just about the power it held, it was about what he had chosen to do with it. The path he had walked, the choices he had made had led him here. And now it was time for him to walk forward, to face what came next, with the knowledge that he had everything he needed to face it. Rick took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the stone in his hand, and he turned away from the clearing. He didn't look back at the pool or the glowing light. The answers would come in time. For now he had to move forward. With each step the world around him seemed to shift again, as though the very fabric of reality had bent and changed with the choices he had made. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. The journey had only just begun. Rick continued through the forest, each step carrying him further into the unknown, but with a strange sense of certainty. The stone in his hand pulsed, steady and sure, as though it were attuned to his every thought, his every heartbeat. The path ahead of him remained cloaked in shadow, the trees towering on either side like silent witnesses, but he no longer felt the isolation he once had. It was as though the forest, the very earth beneath his feet, was guiding him now, as if it too knew the importance of the path he had chosen. The deeper he ventured, the more he noticed how the world around him was changing. The sounds of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling in the wind, were quieter now, as though the world itself was shifting in response to the stone. Even the air seemed different, thicker somehow, filled with the weight of something ancient and forgotten. Rick didn't know exactly what he was feeling, but it was a quiet, deep knowing, one that seemed to come from somewhere far older than himself. The forest was no longer the place of shadows and uncertainty that it had been when he first entered. Now it felt more like a living, breathing entity, its rhythms in tune with his own. The trees seemed to shift as he moved, their branches reaching down like hands, their leaves shimmering in the soft glow of the stone. It wasn't just the environment. That had changed. It was him too. He could feel it inside himself, a transformation taking place, slow but inevitable. The further Rick went, the less he felt the need for the whispers. They had been his guide, his constant companion since he first found the stone, but now it was as though he had internalized their messages, understood their meaning in a deeper way. There was a quiet strength in him now, a growing confidence that was rooted not in power but in understanding. He didn't need to hear the voices of the forest anymore. He was the forest now. He was part of it, as much as the stone in his hand. The stone pulsed again, a steady, rhythmic beat urging him onward. The air around him was heavy with the promise of something to come, but what it was, he couldn't say. The forest had led him this far, but what lay beyond was still unclear. He could feel the pull of something ahead, something that called to him with the same quiet intensity that the stone had always held. He wasn't sure whether it was a destination or a question, but it didn't matter. He had come too far to turn back now. As Rick pushed forward, the trees began to thin. The dense canopy overhead opened up, and he found himself in a small clearing. The ground here was soft and uneven, covered in moss and small, vibrant flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. At the center of the clearing, there was something unexpected. A stone archway, old and weathered, stood as if it had always been there, waiting for him. The archway was unlike anything Rick had ever seen. It wasn't just made of stone. It seemed to pulse with the same energy that radiated from the stone in his hand. The stones themselves were carved with symbols, patterns that looked strangely familiar, though Rick couldn't place them. It was as though the symbols were trying to communicate with him, to convey a meaning that his mind couldn't yet fully grasp. He stepped closer to the archway, the stone in his hand thrumming with energy as he did. There was something about it, something in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as though this archway, this doorway, was a threshold, a boundary between one world and another. The air around it was thick, charged, with a power that felt ancient, and Rick knew deep in his bones that he had arrived at a crossroads. He reached out toward the arch, the stone still pulsing in his hand. As soon as his fingers brushed the cool surface of the stone, the air around him shifted. The world seemed to tremble for a moment, and then, with a sound like a distant, echoing bell, the archway glowed with a soft, ethereal light. The symbols, etched into the stone, began to shimmer, their shapes shifting and changing in a mesmerizing dance. Rick's heart quickened, and he stepped closer, drawn by the pull of the light. The stone in his hand grew hotter, its pulse matching the rhythm of his own heart. The whispers returned, but they weren't words anymore. They were sensations, feelings, a sense of knowing. He could feel the archway calling to him, not just as a physical doorway, but as something far deeper. It was a bridge, a link to something, beyond something he wasn't yet ready to fully understand. "Step through, Rick," the voice came again, clearer now. "The path ahead is yours to walk. But you must choose. Will you cross or will you turn back?" The weight of the question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Rick stared at the glowing archway, the symbols swirling in the air like living things. The choice was his, and he felt it deep in his bones. The forest had brought him here. The stone had guided him, and now the path ahead was before him, waiting. Rick's fingers tightened around the stone in his hand. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he also felt something else, something stronger, a certainty. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't lost, not anymore. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Rick took a step forward, his feet moving toward the glowing archway, the stone in his hand still pulsing with the rhythm of his heart. He didn't know what lay beyond, but he knew that this was the next step in his journey, the moment when everything would change. And as he crossed the threshold, the light enveloped him, and everything around him seemed to fade away. The world shifted, and Rick stepped into something new, something beyond the forest, beyond the stone, beyond everything he had known. The moment Rick stepped through the archway, the world around him seemed to fold in on itself, like a page in a book turning to reveal the next chapter. The light, soft and glowing, enveloped him, and for a brief second he felt weightless, suspended between one world and the next. The air around him hummed with energy, like the very fabric of reality was shifting, reshaping itself to accommodate his presence. He could no longer hear the forest, no longer feel the ground beneath his feet. All of it, his journey, the whispers, the stone, felt like it was fading into the distance, as if the world he had known was slipping away, replaced by something new. The soft glow that surrounded him grew brighter, until it was the only thing he could see. It wasn't harsh, though. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, almost gentle, as if it were inviting him to come closer, to understand it, to see it. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded, leaving Rick standing in a vast, open space. The air here was different, thick, heavy, but with a strange clarity that made everything seem sharper. The ground beneath his feet was no longer the soft, moss-covered earth of the forest, but something else, something smoother, almost metallic yet warm to the touch. He looked down and saw that the surface beneath him shimmered like water, but it was solid, and the patterns it created as he moved were strange, almost hypnotic. The space around him was vast and empty, stretching endlessly in every direction. It felt as though the very atmosphere was in motion, as if the air itself were alive, responding to him. And yet, despite the emptiness, Rick didn't feel alone. There was something here, something that had been waiting for him. The same quiet certainty that had guided him thus far pulsed within him once more, this time stronger than before. In the distance, Rick saw a figure silhouetted against the shimmering backdrop of the space. It was a shape he recognized but hadn't yet fully seen. The figure stood still, unmoving, but Rick felt its presence like a beacon calling to him. It was impossible to tell who or what the figure was, only that it was important, that it had been waiting for him just as he had been waiting for it. He began walking toward it, each step echoing in the vastness around him. With every movement, the surface beneath him rippled, the patterns shifting like liquid, as if the space itself was alive, bending to his will. As he moved closer to the figure, the air seemed to hum with a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm, and the figure remained still, waiting for him. As Rick approached, the figure slowly turned, revealing more of itself. It was tall, its features obscured by a hooded cloak, its face hidden in shadow. Yet there was a strange familiarity to it, something about its presence that made Rick's heart quicken. The figure raised its head slightly, as though it had sensed Rick's arrival. "You've come far, Rick," the voice came, not from the figure, but from everywhere at once, resonating in the space around him. It was deep, calm, and full of an ancient wisdom that Rick couldn't quite place. But this is where the journey truly begins. Rick's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. Everything in him screamed that he knew this voice, this presence, but he couldn't remember where from. He had come so far, traversed such distance, yet here, in this strange, shimmering space, everything felt like a new beginning. "What is this place?" Rick asked, his voice sounding strangely small in the vastness around him. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow as though it were pulling Rick into its orbit. "I am a guide," the voice said, "but I am not the one you seek. I am the one who watches, who waits, the one who leads you to the next step in your journey." Rick took a hesitant step forward, the stone still pulsing gently in his hand. "The next step," he echoed, his mind spinning with the weight of it all. "What does that mean? What is it that I need to find?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering Rick's question. "What you seek cannot be given. Rick, it must be earned, understood. You have been walking this path for a long time, even before you realized it. But now it is time to see beyond what you know, time to awaken the parts of yourself that have been hidden for so long." Rick's heart beat faster as the figure's words sank in. "Hidden parts?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The idea of something hidden inside of him, something waiting to be unlocked, stirred something deep within him. It was both unsettling and exhilarating. The figure remained silent for a moment, then finally spoke again. "The stone is not the answer, Rick. It is the key to the door. You have stepped through the door, but now you must choose what comes next." Rick's grip on the stone tightened, the weight of its presence both grounding and electrifying. It was still warm in his hand, the rhythm of its pulse steady, almost like the beating of his own heart. But it was clear now. The stone wasn't the destination. It was just the beginning. "What happens now?" Rick asked, his voice steadying, as the realization began to take root. He wasn't just here for answers. He was here to unlock something within himself, something that had been waiting for this moment. The figure's shadowed face seemed to soften, as if understanding the depth of Rick's question. "What happens next is up to you, Rick. The path has always been yours to choose. But remember, the door may close once it is opened. Choose wisely." Rick stood still for a moment, his mind racing, his heart pulsing with the same rhythm as the stone. He had come so far. The forest, the stone, the archway, it had all led him here to this moment. The answers weren't out there in the world. They were within him. He had always known that, even before the woman in the water spoke to him. With a deep breath, Rick stepped forward, feeling the pull of the unknown, feeling the space around him shift once more. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. Rick's footsteps seemed to echo louder now, despite the quiet of the space around him. With every step, his senses sharpened, and his awareness of the figure before him grew stronger. The air felt charged, alive, as if it too was waiting for him to make a choice. The figure, still cloaked and unmoving, stood like a sentinel, its presence vast and encompassing, yet oddly gentle, like the calm before a storm. There was no urgency in its stillness, only an invitation. The words the figure had spoken lingered in Rick's mind, swirling like smoke that refused to dissipate. The stone is not the answer. It is the key to the door. The truth of that statement unfolded inside him, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a cloak. The stone wasn't the end. It wasn't the culmination of his journey. It was the beginning. And now, standing in this strange, vast space, Rick realized that he had crossed a threshold, not just physically, but in every part of himself. He had entered a new phase of understanding, one that had been waiting for him all along. His gaze shifted back to the figure. "What happens next?" he asked again, his voice steady now, despite the uncertainty that stirred within him. He wasn't expecting a simple answer, but he had to ask. It felt like the right question. The figure's presence seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, Rick thought he saw the faintest flicker of a smile beneath the hood, as if the figure knew exactly what Rick needed to hear, but would not give it to him directly. There was no voice this time, just the silent understanding that passed between them. The space around Rick seemed to pulse with the figure's response, the words unspoken but clear. It wasn't about the stone or even the space they were in. It was about Rick's choice, his willingness to accept what was unfolding around him and within him. The stone was just a symbol, a catalyst, a spark to ignite the change that had already begun. The true journey, the real discovery, lay in what he did with the truth he had uncovered. As if in response, Rick felt something stir within himself, something both ancient and new, deep and personal. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of everything he had carried so far. His mind raced with flashes of memories, images of the journey he had taken to get here, the quiet moments in the forest, the feeling of the stone's pulse in his hand, the way the world had shifted when he stepped through the archway. All of it, every piece, had led him to this point, to the stillness of this moment. Rick opened his eyes and looked at the figure, now more aware than ever of the choice before him. He wasn't just choosing what came next in the physical world, he was choosing what he would become, how he would see the world moving forward. The path ahead wasn't paved with answers, it was paved with questions, with the unknown. The figure, still unmoving, watched him silently, and Rick realized something then. It had always been up to him. It wasn't the stone or the mysterious figure guiding him. It was his own choices, his ability to understand the truth that had been with him all along. The stone had been a catalyst, yes, but the power to unlock what came next lay within him. Without hesitation, Rick stepped forward toward the figure. As he did, he felt the space around him shift again, but this time the change was subtle, like a deep exhale after holding a breath for too long. The pulse of the stone in his hand grew steady, aligning with his heart, as though everything was coming into balance. The air around him thickened, the rhythm of it quickening as he moved closer. The figure remained still, but as Rick stepped into the space before it, something changed. The energy in the air seemed to coalesce, to focus on him, drawing everything to a singular point, as though this was the moment when the universe itself had decided to reveal its truth. The weight of the space around him became more tangible, like the gravity of a distant star pulling at him, and Rick felt a sense of deep understanding. He wasn't here by accident. He had always been meant to be here, in this moment, in this space. And yet there was something still so deeply mysterious about it. Rick could feel the answers lingering on the edges of his thoughts, but they remained just out of reach, elusive, waiting for him to make sense of them on his own. There was no easy answer, no clear path. But that, Rick realized, was the point. The journey he had taken was never meant to be a straight line. It was meant to be winding, filled with questions and doubts, and all the answers would come in time, only when he was ready. The figure raised its hand slowly, and as it did, the space around Rick seemed to expand, the walls of this place stretching outward, becoming even more vast. The symbols that had once been etched into the stone now swirled in the air, glowing softly, like the light of distant stars. The figure's voice, once more, echoed through the space, gentle yet commanding. "You have chosen, Rick. You have. Crossed the threshold. But remember, this is not the end. It is only the beginning." Rick nodded, the weight of those words settling in his chest. He had always known this journey wasn't about an end. It was about discovery, about unlocking parts of himself he hadn't even known existed. It wasn't about knowing all the answers. It was about learning how to ask the right questions. The figure began to fade slowly, as if dissolving into the very air around Rick, leaving behind only the soft pulse of the stone in his hand, and the vast space that now felt less like a void and more like an open canvas. It was up to him now to fill it, to paint the next strokes on the path ahead. Rick stood still for a moment, taking in the space, the vastness, the endless possibilities. The figure had given him the key, but it was his journey to continue. He felt the weight of the stone shift in his hand, but it wasn't a burden, it was a gift. It was a reminder that he was the one who would shape his path, that the next steps were his to decide. With a deep breath, Rick turned away from the space, stepping forward once again. The world before him was wide open, filled with potential, and he was ready to walk it. As Rick continued walking forward, the vastness around him seemed to press in gently, as if the world itself had drawn closer to him, eager to see what he would do next. He felt the weight of the stone in his hand still, its pulse a steady rhythm, comforting and constant like a heartbeat. The air around him seemed to hum, alive with potential, and as he moved he realized the path before him wasn't just a space, it was a canvas, blank and ready for him to paint. Every step he took seemed to shift the environment subtly, making the unseen seem just a little bit clearer, the unknown a little less intimidating. The figure had faded, leaving him with only the soft pulse of the stone and the knowledge that his journey had only just begun. The words of the figure still echoed faintly in his mind. "You have chosen, Rick. You have crossed the threshold. But remember, this is not the end. It is only the beginning." The weight of those words felt heavier with each step, as if they were wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the mystery, deeper into the truth of this space and of himself. But Rick wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Every part of him was attuned to the energy around him. He felt the stone as an extension of his own body, as though it was an integral part of him now, something that wasn't just in his hand, but in his mind, in his heart. The connection between him and the stone had deepened, and it wasn't just an object, it was a bridge, one that spanned the distance between who he was and who he was meant to be. He reached out, touching the air in front of him, as if he could physically sense the path taking shape, even though it remained invisible. The space around him was shifting, bending, almost like the world was folding inward and outward in slow, deliberate motions. There was something deeply surreal about it, something dreamlike, but it was also clear that this place was real, or at least as real as anything could be in this strange, unfathomable realm. The ground beneath his feet began to ripple, the surface still metallic, yet warmer now, more fluid. The air thickened, and a deep sense of purpose washed over Rick. The figure's absence had left a space that only he could fill, a silence that only his own actions could break. He wasn't lost in this place, not anymore. He had crossed the threshold, but the real journey lay in choosing what he would do with it now. Suddenly the space shifted again, the rhythmic pulse of the stone intensifying. It felt like a warning, but also like an invitation. The walls, if they could be called walls, of the vast space before him shimmered and began to form new shapes, new patterns, as if the environment itself was responding to Rick's presence, shaping itself to his desires, to his questions. And then, without warning, a new voice filled the air. The same deep, resonant voice from before, but now there was a softness to it, an understanding. You have the stone. You have crossed the threshold. Now you must choose what comes next. Rick? The voice was not commanding, but reassuring, gentle, as though it were reminding him of something he had always known deep within himself. But what was the choice? What was waiting for him in this infinite space? Rick's gaze turned to the patterns that were forming in the air, shifting lines, glowing symbols that seemed to pulse with life. They moved like living things, swirling and intertwining, weaving themselves into intricate designs. It was a map, he realized, a map that didn't lead anywhere in the traditional sense. It wasn't a path to be followed in a linear fashion. It was something more complex, something more fluid. The stone in his hand began to glow more intensely, and as it did, the symbols in the air responded, their shapes growing clearer. Rick felt himself being drawn to one particular symbol, one that was just beginning to take shape. It was a circle, intricately woven with lines that seemed to represent the cycles of life, of time, of change. There was something ancient in it, something familiar that resonated deep within him, like a memory just out of reach, a dream that flickered on the edge of his mind. As his eyes focused on the symbol, the ground beneath him began to hum, the vibrations coming from it growing stronger. The air around him thickened again, the energy becoming palpable, like the atmosphere was alive, breathing with him, moving with him. Rick raised the stone higher, the warmth of it now enveloping his entire hand, spreading through his arm, filling his chest, his heart. The space before him seemed to pulse with his own rhythm, as if the very fabric of reality was syncing with him, with his choices. The voice returned, clearer now, as if speaking directly into his mind. You are at the crossroads, Rick. The choices you make now will shape the world you step into. The stone is but a tool, but your will is what shapes its power. Rick's mind raced with the weight of those words, his will. The stone had always felt like a guide, something that led him forward, but now he realized that it had never been the stone leading him. It had been his own choices, his own desires. That had shaped this path. The stone had simply been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the fire of understanding. He looked around at the shifting patterns, the glowing symbols, and for the first time since entering this place, Rick felt a deep understanding of the journey ahead. It wasn't about answers. It wasn't about reaching a final destination. It was about growth, about finding his place within this vast space and understanding how to move forward, how to use the stone, how to choose the next step. Rick stepped forward, the symbols on the ground glowing in time with the beat of his heart. He raised the stone again, feeling the warmth, feeling the power of it, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a power he was holding, it was the power of choice, of creation, of transformation. The patterns in the air shifted, swirling faster now, merging into one larger, more complex symbol, a shape that seemed to represent everything, the past, the present, the future. It was a map, a guide, and Rick knew deep within himself that this was his path now. This was his choice. With a final deep breath, Rick stepped into the center of the glowing symbol. The stone pulsed once more, brighter than before, and the world around him shifted. The space was no longer empty. It was filled with possibilities, filled with light, and Rick knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it. As Rick stood at the center of the glowing symbol, the air around him seemed to hum with a steady energy, like the very fabric of reality was resonating with his choices. The stone in his hand pulsed in rhythm with his heart, and he felt a connection to everything around him. The shimmering patterns in the air, the energy beneath his feet, and the vast expanse of space that stretched out before him. It was as though all of this had been waiting for him, for his choices, for the moment when he would step into this unknown with eyes wide open, ready to embrace what came next. The light that surrounded him seemed to grow brighter, sharper, and, for a fleeting second, Rick wondered if he had somehow crossed into another realm. Everything felt both strangely familiar and completely new, like waking from a dream that had just begun to reveal its meaning, but the answers were still just out of reach. The patterns in the air above him began to shift, changing shape and flowing into something more intricate, more defined. They moved like liquid, swirling with purpose, pulling him in, guiding him. And in that swirling design, Rick saw it, the face, the half-remembered figure that had appeared in the water, the woman who had spoken to him. But now her face was clearer, more defined, as if the mystery surrounding her had finally begun to unravel. "You have come far, Rick," the voice spoke again. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, like a vibration that resonated there through the very air itself. It wasn't the same voice that had guided him before, but it felt just as familiar, just as important. "But you must understand. This is the moment of transformation. This is where the stone becomes you." Rick's grip on the stone tightened, but it no longer felt like something separate from him. It had become part of him, its energy flowing through him, syncing with his heartbeat, his breath. He could feel the pull of it, the power of it, but he also knew that the stone, in all its mystery, was only the beginning of the journey. He wasn't here to possess power. He was here to understand it, to become something more. "What am I supposed to do with it?" Rick asked, the words slipping from his lips before he could fully grasp why they had come out. There was a certainty in the question, a quiet urgency that made his chest tighten, as if he were on the cusp of a great revelation. The figure in the patterns above him shifted again, its face softening into something almost reassuring. "What you must do, Rick, is choose, not just what to do with the stone, but what to do with the power it represents, what to do with the truth that it reveals." The weight of those words settled deep within Rick, the meaning of them beginning to unfurl in his mind, like the petals of a flower. This wasn't just about control, about wielding power. It was about understanding, about becoming something that could hold that power with grace, with purpose. "You've already taken the first step," the voice continued. Its tone gentle but firm. "But this is only the beginning. What you decide to do next will shape not just your path, but the world around you. There is much more to learn, Rick, but only through understanding will you know how to move forward." Rick exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the figure's words settle into his chest. He understood now. The stone had been a key, but the true transformation was within him. It wasn't about finding a way to bend the world to his will. It was about learning how to exist within it, with the power of the stone, not as a force to command, but as a part of him. The air seemed to thicken, and the glowing patterns in front of him swirled once again, this time faster, more urgently. He felt a surge of energy, an intense pull, and for a moment it felt as though the world around him was rushing to meet him, as if everything that had been waiting for him, his choices, his understanding, his growth, was finally coming together. In this one moment, Rick raised the stone higher, feeling the warmth of it fill his entire being. The space around him seemed to respond, the patterns in the air reflecting the light of the stone, growing brighter, more intricate. The symbol of the circle with interwoven lines flickered in front of him, as if urging him forward. He knew now what it represented, not just the cycles of time, of life, but the interconnections between all things, the stone, the journey, the transformation. It was all part of one greater whole. And then, as the glow around him intensified, he felt it, a shift, a deepening, as if the very air had been woven into something new. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just speaking. To him, it was speaking through him. "You are the keeper now, Rick, not just of the stone, but of the truth it carries. You will see the world differently, understand it in ways that others cannot. But remember, with this understanding comes responsibility. You must use this gift wisely, for the path ahead will not always be clear." Rick's heart beat faster, as the weight of those words pressed down on him. Responsibility. It was no longer just about understanding the world. It was about shaping it. The stone had been a guide, but he had to learn to walk the path it pointed to make decisions that reflected the deeper truths he had come to understand. With a final, steadying breath, Rick closed his eyes, feeling the energy of the stone pulse through him once again. He knew that the world was full of uncertainty, full of questions. But in that moment, he also understood that it wasn't the certainty that mattered. It was the willingness to face the unknown, to walk forward with the power to shape it in his hands. When he opened his eyes again, the patterns in the air had softened, their glow dimming to a gentle, steady light. The space around him was still, and the path ahead of him had finally become clear. He didn't know what the next step would bring, but he knew that he was ready to take it. Rick stepped forward, the stone still warm in his hand, his heart steady and sure. He had crossed the threshold, embraced the transformation, and now, with the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders, he was ready to see what the world had waiting for him. Rick stepped forward, feeling the weight of the stone settle deeper into his hand, the pulse within it, now a steady rhythmic thrum that seemed to echo in time with his own heartbeat. The air around him felt different now, more tangible, more alive, as though the very fabric of reality had changed in some subtle but profound way. The glow that had filled the space had softened into something gentler, a quiet illumination that seemed to guide him forward without haste, as if everything was unfolding at exactly the right pace. The space before him was vast but not intimidating. It stretched out in all directions, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, as if everything Rick needed was right here, waiting for him to discover it. The figures, the voices, the mysterious figure that had guided him, it all felt like it had been part of a carefully woven tapestry, each thread leading him to this moment, this space, this choice. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he didn't need to know. There was a quiet confidence in him now, a certainty that wasn't based on answers, but on understanding. The stone had revealed something to him, not just about the world around him, but about himself. He had always known he was meant for something more, something beyond the ordinary, but now he understood that it wasn't about seeking power or control. It was about understanding how to exist with it, how to balance the forces that swirled within him and around him. The figure that had once been an ethereal presence in the distance seemed to fade from his mind, leaving only the faintest traces of its guidance. It wasn't needed anymore. Rick had crossed the threshold, and now the path ahead was his to walk, his to shape. He wasn't alone in this space, not really. The whispers that had once been so elusive, so distant, now felt like part of him, woven into his very thoughts. The figure had given him the tools, but it was Rick's choice that would determine what came next. He moved forward, feeling the pull of the space, the silent invitation of what lay ahead. The ground beneath him rippled with each step, as if the very earth responded to his presence, to his will. He felt as though the space itself was in tune with him, each motion of his body, each thought, creating ripples in the air, in the light, in the very fabric of the world. He had never felt so connected, so aware of the world around him, and then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted once again, this time not in response to his movement, but of its own accord. The ripples in the ground intensified, spreading outward like waves in a pond. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, steady frequency that Rick could feel in his chest, in the very core of his being. He stopped, instinctively, as though something deep within him was telling him to wait, to listen. The stone in his hand pulsed once, twice, its rhythm matching the beat of his heart. And then the voice returned. It wasn't the same voice from before, but it was familiar, like the whisper of the wind, soft yet urgent. "You have come far, Rick, but there is more still to do." The voice filled the air around him, not with force, but with a quiet authority, as though it were an extension of the space itself, of the energy that surrounded him. It wasn't asking for action, but for reflection, for understanding. "What must I do now?" Rick asked, the question slipping from his lips before he could fully understand why. He knew deep down that the path wasn't going to be laid out for him. He had to create it step by step. The voice was silent for a moment, but Rick could feel the weight of the silence, the power of it pressing down on him. And then the response came, not in words, but in sensations, like images blooming in his mind, flashes of insight and understanding. "You must learn to see the world through new eyes, Rick. The stone has unlocked a part of you, but there are layers yet to be peeled away. The journey isn't just about what lies ahead. It's about what lies within you. You are the key to the next stage, the next revelation. But to unlock it, you must first understand the path you've already walked." Rick's chest tightened as the words reverberated through him. The path he had walked, He thought he understood it, thought he had crossed every threshold, but now he realized there was something deeper, something he hadn't yet fully grasped. It wasn't just about the physical journey, the places he had visited, the people he had met. It was about his own evolution, the layers of himself he had yet to uncover. He was not just a traveler in this world, he was part of the world, and the world was part of him. The space around him shifted again, the patterns in the air swirling and folding upon themselves. It wasn't chaos, though. It was like the patterns of his own thoughts, his understanding of himself, taking shape before him. Everything felt connected. Everything had a place. The whispers weren't gone now. They were louder, more distinct, resonating with the pulse of the stone, with his own heart. Rick knew now that the journey had never been about finding something external. It had always been about understanding the self. What the stone had unlocked was not just knowledge or power. It was his own ability to shape the world around him, to see it through the eyes of someone who was both a part of it and separate from it. He took a slow breath, the weight of everything, pressing down on him, and then he stepped forward once again. This time there was no uncertainty, there was no hesitation. He was no longer waiting for the path to reveal itself, he was creating it with each step. The stone pulsed once more, its glow fading and then intensifying, matching the rhythm of his movement. The world around him seemed to respond, the space shifting with every choice he made, every step he took. The ground beneath him rippled with his thoughts, and as he moved forward the path began to take shape, slowly at first, but then faster, more defined. Rick didn't know what awaited him, but he knew that the journey was his to create, his to shape. He had already crossed the threshold. Now it was time to move forward, to take the next step and understand what came next. And as he stepped into the unknown, the air around him hummed with possibility. The journey had just begun. As Rick moved forward, the ground beneath his feet shifted again and the world around him seemed to fold in on itself, as though the very nature of reality was responding to his movements. The light around him remained, soft but grew steadier, more consistent, as though he had finally entered the heart of whatever this place was. There were no boundaries now, no clear walls or edges, just the space itself pulsing with energy and possibility. The stone in his hand still hummed with warmth, but now it felt less like an object and more like an extension of himself. Every beat, every thrum of energy that passed through it seemed to align with his own thoughts, his own emotions. It was no longer a thing he held, but something he had become one with. As he walked, it wasn't just the space around him that responded. It was his own being, his mind, his heart. The further he went, the more it felt like he was walking through the fabric of his own consciousness, unraveling layers of understanding that had been hidden from him for so long. The symbols that had been swirling in the air, the patterns that had guided him here, began to take on more distinct shapes. They no longer flickered in and out of view but remained solid, grounded, forming a clear, intricate network of lines and curves. Rick recognized some of them now, patterns that had appeared in flashes before. The swirling designs of the symbol in the air, the etched markings in the stone, they were all connected, part of a greater whole, and as he moved they seemed to pulse in response, guiding him, showing him the path ahead. But there was something else now, something more than just the patterns, more than just the space. He felt it deep inside him, a presence, an energy, something vast and unknowable. It wasn't like the voices from before, distant and cryptic. No, this presence was different. It wasn't separate from him. It felt like it was part of him, as if he had always been connected to it, and only now was he beginning to understand how. He stopped for a moment, allowing the pull of the energy to wash over him. He had crossed the threshold, yes, but he understood. Now that the threshold wasn't a physical place, it wasn't something he could simply step through and leave behind. It was an inner crossing, a transformation that was still unfolding. The space around him was not just a backdrop for his journey. It was a reflection of his own internal world, of the choices he had made, the paths he had taken. It was a mirror of his own growth. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, stronger now, as if responding to his thoughts. He raised it before him, and the symbols in the air shifted, swirling around the stone, forming a new pattern, one he had never seen before. It was intricate, delicate but powerful, a network of lines that seemed to represent the interconnection of all things. The stone was no longer just a key to understanding this world. It was a guide to understanding himself, to understanding the forces that moved within him and through the universe around him. Rick took a slow breath, his mind racing with the implications of what he was seeing. The stone, the symbols, the energy, everything he had encountered so far had been leading him toward this moment. He realized that he was not just a passive observer in this world. He was an active participant, a creator of the reality that surrounded him. He had the power to shape it, to mold it, but only by understanding it first. "It's up to you now," the voice came again, soft but filled with an undeniable truth. It wasn't the same voice as before, but it carried the same weight, the same calm authority. It was not just speaking to him, it was speaking through him, through his own thoughts, his own consciousness. What you do with the stone, with the power you've unlocked, is yours to decide. But understand, Rick, that the choices you make will ripple through all of existence. You are not just shaping your path, you are shaping the world around you. Rick's chest tightened as the weight of those words sank in. He had always thought of the stone as something outside of himself, something he had found and held. But now he understood that the stone wasn't just an object. It was a tool, yes, but it was also a reflection of his own potential, his own growth. It was a mirror, showing him what he could become, what he was already starting to be. And now, it was up to him to choose how to wield that power. He looked down at the stone in his hand. The symbols that had been swirling around him had become clearer now, each line and curve a reflection of the choices he had made, the lessons he had learned. And as the stone pulsed again, he knew that the path ahead was not going to be easy. It wasn't meant to be. It was a journey, and like all journeys, it would require courage, strength, and wisdom. But he had the tools to face it. He had always had them. With a deep breath, Rick stepped forward again, the stone still glowing softly in his hand. The path before him remained uncertain, but it no longer felt intimidating. It was his path to create, his journey to shape. And as he moved forward, the space around him responded, shifting to accommodate his every step, his every thought. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Rick realized that the world around him was alive with potential, waiting for him to tap into it. The presence, that vast energy he had felt before, grew stronger now, not separate from him, but intertwined with him. It was as though he was one with it, as if his every action, his every choice was part of the greater flow of existence. And with that understanding came a sense of peace, a certainty that whatever came next, he was ready for it. The stone pulsed one final time, and as Rick continued forward, the path before him grew clearer, the symbols in the air forming a map, a guide for what was to come. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just walking through this world. He was shaping it, creating it with every step, with every choice. And in that moment, Rick knew that the journey he had embarked on was far greater than he had ever imagined. He was ready to see where it would take him. As Rick moved deeper into the vast, shifting space around him, he could feel the weight of every step, every choice, pressing down on him. The stone in his hand pulsed steadily, its rhythm now a familiar beat that echoed within him. It wasn't just guiding him anymore, it had become part of him, a piece of his very being. The energy that surrounded him, the glowing symbols, the shifting patterns, it was all intertwined, all connected, and all waiting for him to understand it. He had crossed through the threshold. Yes, but he realized that it wasn't about the destination. The path itself was the journey. Every choice he made now rippled through the space, shaping it in subtle ways. The world around him wasn't just responding to him, it was evolving with him, changing with each step he took. And with each step, the answers came into sharper focus, not in the form of clarity, but in the form of understanding. The symbols, the energy, the stone, it wasn't just about power. It was about balance, about connection, about becoming something more. The silence that had followed him through this journey was no longer oppressive. It felt natural now, as though the quiet was a part of the world itself, waiting for him to fill it with meaning. The absence of sound wasn't empty. It was the space where creation happened. The stillness was a canvas, and Rick was the artist. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the glowing patterns surrounding him growing more intricate, more detailed with every passing moment. The light shifted subtly, casting soft shadows that danced along the ground, weaving their own story, just as the patterns in the air had been doing all along. The air seemed to hum with energy, alive with the possibilities that awaited him. It wasn't a place of silence anymore. It was a place of potential, of transformation. And then as he walked, he felt a shift. It wasn't something he could see, but something he could feel, deep within himself. The stone pulsed once more, its light growing brighter for a brief moment, and the symbols around him seemed to converge, drawing together like threads in a loom. Rick stopped in his tracks, sensing that something was about to unfold, something important, something that he had been preparing for without even realizing it. The presence that had been quietly watching him all this time seemed to grow stronger, filling the space with a gentle, reassuring weight. It was no longer a distant force, something outside of himself. It was inside him now, part of him, a presence he couldn't separate from. It was the essence of understanding, of becoming, and it spoke again, not with words, but with a feeling, a deep resonant knowing. You have come far, Rick, but now you must learn to see with your heart, not just your mind. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It filled the space, but more importantly, it filled Rick's mind, his soul. He understood the message at once. It wasn't just about perceiving the world with clarity. It was about feeling it, connecting to it at a deeper level. He wasn't just here to understand the world around him. He was here to become a part of it, to shape it with everything he was, with every part of himself that had been hidden, waiting for this moment. Rick closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and for the first time he felt the full weight of the journey. The stone, still warm in his hand, wasn't a power to wield. It was a tool to unlock the truth of himself, of the world, and of the energy that flowed through everything. It was a key, not to a door, but to a deeper understanding of the very fabric of existence. It was not about mastering the stone. It was about mastering the self. He opened his eyes, and the space around him seemed to shimmer, the light bending and folding around him, responding to his understanding, to his choice. The patterns in the air shifted again, swirling together, like a whirlpool, but this time Rick wasn't just an observer. He was part of it. The symbols swirled around him, forming a path, a new road that stretched out before him, glowing with possibility. With steady hands, Rick raised the stone once more, and as he did, the path ahead began to solidify. The air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse in time with the rhythm of the stone, as if the very earth was alive, alive with the choices he was making, the steps he was taking. The light around him glowed brighter, illuminating the path ahead. But it wasn't just a path, it was a journey, one that was his to create, his to walk. The world had been waiting for him, for his choices, for his actions. And now, with the understanding that had settled deep within him, Rick was ready to take the next step, ready to move forward into the unknown. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and uncertainties, but he also knew that he was no longer the same person who had entered this space. He had changed, transformed by everything he had learned, by everything he had experienced. He looked down at the stone one last time, the light in it, flickering like a flame, steady and constant. It wasn't just a guide. It was a part of him, a part of the world, a part of everything. With one final breath, Rick stepped forward into the path that had opened before him. The stone pulsed once more, its rhythm matching his own heartbeat. The world around him shifted, but this time it didn't feel strange or uncertain. It felt right, like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey had been long, but it had led him to this moment, and now, with the stone still warm in his hand and the world ready to meet him, he was ready for whatever came next. As Rick continued forward, the path beneath his feet seemed to open up before him, not in a literal sense, but in a way that made the space around him feel less like an obstacle and more like an extension of his own thoughts, his own understanding. It was as though every step was making the invisible more tangible, pulling everything he had learned together into a single unified moment. The air was thick with possibility, the very fabric of reality trembling in response to his presence. The stone still pulsed steadily in his hand, but it no longer felt like something he controlled. It felt like something he was, a conduit, a reflection of the energy around him and within him. The path ahead remained uncertain, a shimmer of light in the distance, but with each step it became clearer. It wasn't the destination that mattered, it was the journey itself, and Rick now understood that the path wasn't something to follow. It was something to create. The world around him continued to shift, the space fluid and ever-changing, but there was no longer any disorientation, no longer any doubt. The air hummed with energy, with life, and Rick felt it coursing through him, syncing with his heartbeat. It was as if he had become part of the space itself, a living extension of the patterns that flowed through it. His every movement, every thought, seemed to shape the world around him in subtle ways, like a painter bringing their canvas to life with each brushstroke. As he moved, the symbols in the air began to take on more defined shapes, and this time, they weren't just abstract patterns, they were familiar. They were his symbols, reflections of the journey he had already walked. They weren't mere designs, they were a map of the choices he had made and the ones that were still to come. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, and this time Rick felt a deeper connection to it, as if it were no longer an external object, but an internal guide. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the steady rhythm of its pulse, and when he opened them again, the world had shifted once more. The path before him was no longer just a concept, it had become a road, a real physical path that stretched out in front of him. But the road was not the same as it had been before. It was lined with symbols, with markers that Rick now understood. Each symbol was a checkpoint, a reminder of the lessons he had learned, the choices he had made. They were no longer abstract concepts. They were his foundation, his understanding, his power. The stone had been a key, but it had unlocked something much deeper, a recognition of his place in the world, a sense of responsibility and purpose that was his to define. As Rick walked along the path, the ground beneath his feet felt more solid, more grounded, and with every step the symbols on the road seemed to glow brighter, lighting his way. There was no longer any hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty. Each choice he made was a reflection of the deeper understanding he had gained, and the world around him responded to it, bending and shifting in a way that felt natural, like the space was alive, in tune with him. He walked for what felt like hours, though time seemed irrelevant here in this space between worlds. The light that surrounded him shifted as he moved, no longer a blinding brightness but a soft, constant glow that seemed to pulse in time with the stone, in time with his own heart. The rhythm of it was comforting, grounding, and Rick understood that this was the natural flow of things, everything connected, everything in sync. As he moved, he began to feel a sense of completion, not in the sense of finishing a task, but in the sense of understanding the larger picture. The journey had always been about discovery, about peeling back the layers of reality, of existence. And now, as the symbols around him began to fade, he realized that what he had discovered wasn't a destination. It was the truth of his own transformation. He was no longer just walking through this space. He had become part of it. He was the manifestation of the lessons he had learned, the choices he had made, and the path he had forged. The stone in his hand pulsed gently, and he felt it. His connection to everything around him, to the world, to the energy that flowed through all things. He wasn't just shaping the world with his choices. He was becoming the world itself. The path before him began to narrow, the light around him dimming slightly, but not in a threatening way. It was as though the space was preparing him for the next stage of his journey, the next layer of understanding. He wasn't finished, not yet, but he was ready. Whatever came next, whatever awaited him beyond this moment, he knew that he had the tools to face it. The stone had unlocked something deep inside him, and now it was his to wield, his to understand. As Rick took one final step forward, the light around him flickered, and then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air went still. The ground beneath him settled, the symbols fading into the distance, leaving only the steady hum of the stone and the rhythm of his own breath. The world had fallen silent, but in that silence, Rick felt a deep sense of peace. He had arrived at a place of understanding, a place where he could finally let go of the uncertainty and simply be. The journey had led him here, to this moment of stillness, of clarity. And now, as the space around him faded into quiet, Rick understood that he was ready to face whatever came next. He had crossed through the thresholds, and with each step, he had become more than just a traveler. He was part of the journey itself. He took one last deep breath, feeling the weight of the stone in his hand, and then, with a final step, he let go of everything. The journey had only just begun. As Rick stepped into the stillness, he felt the very weight of the space around him shift. The pulse of the stone in his hand was steady, reassuring, as though it had found its place within him, as though he had found his place within it. The light that had surrounded him, the hum of energy, all of it seemed to settle into a calm, deep silence. It was as if everything had taken a collective breath and was now waiting for the next moment to unfold. For a long moment, Rick simply stood there, letting the silence wash over him. It wasn't an emptiness, but a fullness, like the space was alive with possibilities, with things unsaid, things waiting to be understood. He could feel the energy in the air, like a gentle current flowing just beneath the surface of reality, ready to carry him forward when the time came. The stone, still warm in his hand, pulsed again, but this time the rhythm was different. It wasn't frantic or urgent. It was soft, deliberate, like a heartbeat in perfect harmony with the stillness around him. It was as if the stone was syncing with his own heartbeat, aligning with the deeper pulse of the world itself. And in that moment, Rick realized that this was the final stage of his journey. Not a destination, but an awakening. He was no longer just walking through the world. He was part of it, and it was part of him. He closed his eyes, and in that stillness, he felt a sudden pull within himself. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like the world was gently urging him forward. The weight of the journey he had taken, the lessons he had learned, all of it was converging into this one moment. He could feel the space shifting around him again, but not in a way that felt unfamiliar or overwhelming. It was a soft shift, a gentle tug forward, like a door slowly opening. Rick opened his eyes, and the world around him began to change. The steady pulse of the stone in his hand grew brighter for a moment, and with it the air seemed to shimmer, the light bending and folding like a soft breeze brushing against the surface of a calm lake. The space around him seemed to stretch and fold, as if the very fabric of reality was bending with his every thought, his every movement. The symbols that had danced in the air earlier began to reappear, but this time they were more solid, more defined. They didn't feel distant or abstract anymore. They felt familiar, as though they had always been a part of him. With each symbol that appeared, Rick felt a deeper connection to it. The interwoven lines, the patterns that had seemed so complex before now felt like part of a simple, elegant design. They were no longer just shapes in the air. They were a map, a guide to understanding not just the world around him, but himself. He could feel the connection between each symbol, each pattern, and the steady pulse of the stone, like threads, weaving together to form a complete picture. But it wasn't just about the symbols. It was about how they were connected to him, how his every choice, his every step, had brought him here, to this point of understanding. It wasn't just the world that was shifting, it was him. He had become part of the space, part of the energy that surrounded him, and he realized as he stood there that this was his true transformation. Not in what he had learned, but in what he had become. The presence, the vast energy that had been with him all along grew stronger now, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was reassuring, like a soft breath against his skin, gentle but steady. The space around him seemed to respond, bending and shifting in time with his thoughts, like it was awaiting his next choice. The whispers, once distant and elusive, had become clearer, more focused. They weren't just messages from the world anymore. They were his own thoughts, his own consciousness, echoing through the space, guiding him toward the next step. "You've come far, Rick," the voice spoke again, not as an external force, but as part of him. It wasn't the same as before, but it had the same comforting resonance. "But now you must make the choice. Will you continue the journey? Will you step into what you've become and shape the world around you? Rick felt the weight of the questions settle within him. It wasn't about the destination anymore. It was about how he chose to walk the path from here. It was about embracing what he had become, accepting the power he had unlocked, and using it not to control the world, but to shape it. The stone had been a guide, yes, but it was only a tool. It was his understanding, his growth, that would determine how the world would unfold. Rick took a deep breath, feeling the steady pulse of the stone, feeling the connection to everything around him. It wasn't just the world he was shaping, it was himself. He was no longer a passive observer in his own life. He was a creator, a participant in the flow of energy that surrounded him. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just the final stage of his journey. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where he was the one who would shape the path ahead. With a final, steadying breath, Rick stepped forward, the stone still warm in his hand. The air around him shifted once more, but this time, it didn't feel like a force pulling him forward. It felt like the world in all its complexity was unfolding around him, waiting for him to step into it. The path ahead wasn't set. It wasn't clear. But Rick knew one thing. It was his to create. And that was all that mattered. The symbols in the air swirled around him one last time, and the space began to solidify, becoming clearer, more defined. Rick's heart beat steady in his chest, his thoughts calm and focused as he took the next step into the unknown. Whatever came next, he knew he was ready. He had always been ready. As Rick stepped forward, the air seemed to part before him, like the world itself was adjusting to his movements, aligning with his newfound purpose. The space around him felt both endless and intimate, stretching out like a vast ocean but enclosing him with a sense of purpose, like the very universe was waiting for him to decide how to navigate it. The stone still pulsed in his hand, a steady rhythm that echoed deep within him. It wasn't just guiding him anymore, it was becoming him. Every breath, every thought, every step felt like a choice, his choice to shape what came next. The path before him was no longer a mere concept. It had solidified into something real, something he could feel with every fiber of his being. The symbols, the patterns in the air, all the pieces of the world around him had converged. And now they were no longer separate. They were part of him, an extension of the understanding he had gained. The journey had always been about more than just the external world. It had been about his internal world, his growth, his transformation. And now the world outside was reflecting that change. The space around him continued to shift, but now it was more subtle. The movement was less about chaos, less about uncertainty, and more about alignment. Everything around him was synchronizing, as if the universe was breathing in time with him, flowing with his decisions. The symbols on the ground and in the air shifted too, their lines more defined, their shapes clearer. As though the world was no longer just responding to him, it was adapting to him, showing him that he was an active participant in what was unfolding. Rick moved forward, and the steady pulse of the stone remained in sync with the world around him. It wasn't just the stone anymore. It was him. He could feel it in his chest, this deep sense of connection, as if the fabric of the universe had woven him into its very being. Every step, every choice, was a reaffirmation of his place in it all. He was no longer a passive observer. He was part of the dance, part of the creation. He stopped, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. The symbols on the ground before him formed a pattern that seemed to beckon him like a doorway. It wasn't a physical doorway. It was a doorway of understanding, a passage into a deeper awareness. The stone pulsed again, and this time it was not a call to action, but a confirmation. This was the moment of transition. The next stage of his journey wasn't something to be feared. It was something to embrace, something to step into. With that realization, Rick stepped forward again, and as he did, the space shifted once more. But this time it wasn't as dramatic, as overwhelming. It was seamless, natural, like he was moving through water. The patterns around him adjusted, flowed in sync with his movement. He was no longer struggling to find his place. He was simply moving with it, flowing with the energy, with the world around him. He felt a sudden clarity, a knowing. The path ahead was not laid out for him, but he no longer needed it to be. He wasn't lost. He never had been. The space, the world, the journey, it all made sense now. He wasn't here to control the world or understand it in some detached way. He was here to be with it, to create with it. His connection to the stone had unlocked that truth, but the truth had always been within him. The stone was a guide, yes, but it was the way he chose to use it, to be with it, that mattered. Rick could feel the energy around him, shifting and bending like a current flowing through water. The path ahead was clear now, not because it was defined, but because he understood how to walk it. The uncertainty was still there, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like an invitation to create, to move, to be, as... He took another step. The light around him shifted again, deepening, softening, but still glowing with an inner warmth. He was no longer just walking the path. He was the path. He could feel it in his bones, in the stone, in the world around him. Everything was aligned now, his choices, his understanding, his connection to the universe. This wasn't a destination. It wasn't even the end of the journey. It was the beginning, the first step into a world where he had the power to shape what came next, not just for himself, but for everything that existed within this vast, connected reality. The stone in his hand pulsed again, a final confirmation. And Rick felt a sense of peace settle within him. He had crossed many thresholds to get here, but the final threshold was not a place, it was an understanding. It was the realization that the journey was never about reaching an end. It was about embracing each moment, each step, each choice, and seeing how those choices unfolded into something new. He stood still for a moment, feeling the energy of the world around him, feeling his place in it. And then, with a steady breath, he took another step. He wasn't stepping into the unknown anymore. He was stepping into the known, into the truth that had always been there, waiting for him to see it. Rick continued to walk, and with each step, the world responded, not as an external force, but as a living, breathing entity, aligned with him. The path stretched out before him, not as a series of steps to be taken, but as a canvas waiting to be painted, waiting for him to shape it with every choice, every action. The journey had not ended. It had only just begun. Rick continued to move, his steps light yet sure, as though he were walking through a world that had been waiting for him to truly see it. The path beneath him was no longer just a way forward. It felt like a living entity, shifting in tune with his thoughts, as though the very ground was an extension of his mind, responding to his choices with each step. The air around him hummed with energy, a constant undercurrent that resonated in time with the steady pulse of the stone in his hand. As he walked, the environment around him seemed to change, but not in any way that felt abrupt. The world adjusted to his presence, the light around him deepening, softening, blending into the air with a seamless grace. The symbols that had been guiding him were now fading into the background, no longer necessary. The path ahead was no longer marked by those glowing symbols. They had been absorbed into him, part of his understanding now. There was no longer a need for a guide. He had become the guide. The stone was warm in his hand, the pulse of it now a steady rhythm that mirrored the beat of his heart. With every breath, he could feel its connection to him deepening, not just as an object, but as an extension of his own consciousness. The stone wasn't leading him anymore. It was simply there, part of the space, part of him. He was no longer separate from the world he moved through. He had become part of it. The boundaries between himself and the universe, now blurred in ways he couldn't quite explain. With each step, the space around him seemed to unfold, but not in the way that the path had before. It wasn't like the beginning when the world had been so foreign, so unfamiliar. Now it was as though everything had clicked into place. Every piece, every choice, every moment had been leading him to this. He wasn't walking through a strange landscape anymore. He was walking through his own understanding of the world, of himself. The journey had never been about discovering something out there. It had always been about discovering the power within, the ability to shape the world not by force, but by understanding its deeper rhythms. Ahead, Rick could see something, a glimmer, a flicker of light. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't a beacon or an invitation. It was something more, a presence. It was subtle, almost like a reflection of the energy that surrounded him, but it was more than that. It felt like something, or someone, waiting for him, watching, but not with expectation. More like an acknowledgement, a recognition of the transformation he had undergone. The stone in his hand pulsed again, but this time it wasn't a signal to move forward. It was a signal to pause. Rick stopped, the air around him thick with understanding. The space had shifted, not physically, but in a way that felt deeply personal. He wasn't just walking through a world anymore. He was part of the fabric of it, and it was part of him. As if responding to his realization, the light ahead grew brighter, its glow soft but steady, its warmth familiar. He reached out with his free hand instinctively, as though the space itself had invited him to come closer, to embrace whatever came next. He wasn't afraid. There was no uncertainty in him now. There was only a quiet knowing, a certainty that this was the next step in his journey, not just to understand, but to be. With a final, steadying breath, Rick stepped forward once again, moving toward the light. The air around him seemed to ripple, but it didn't feel unsettling. It felt like a soft invitation. He reached out, the stone still warm in his hand, and the moment his fingers touched the light, everything shifted. The world around him didn't collapse, but expanded. The light didn't blind him. Instead, it embraced him, a gentle force that wrapped around him, filling him with warmth, with understanding. It was as though every piece of his journey had led him to this exact moment, this exact realization. The light was no longer just an external force. It was part of him, and he was part of it. And in that moment, Rick understood. The space wasn't a place. It was a state of being. The journey had never been about reaching the end. It had been about becoming, about aligning himself with the flow of energy that moved through everything. It was about understanding that the universe wasn't something he moved through. It was something he was part of, and it was part of him. The light wasn't just illumination. It was transformation. It was the energy that ran through him, through the stone, through everything around him, and it had always been there, waiting for him to realize it. As the light enveloped him, Rick felt something change, something deep within. He didn't know exactly what had shifted, but he could feel it. It wasn't a dramatic change. Nothing external had shifted. But internally, Rick felt aligned, connected. He wasn't just standing in the world. He was part of it in the most profound way. The warmth of the light lingered for a moment longer, and then it faded, leaving Rick standing in the stillness once more. But now everything felt different. The silence that had once been so vast and overwhelming now felt peaceful, reassuring. It was as though the universe itself was breathing with him, in sync with him. The stone in his hand was still warm, still pulsing with energy, but it wasn't separate from him. It was simply an extension of his own being, his own understanding. The energy that had flowed through the world, through the symbols, through the space, he could feel it within him now, as natural as his own breath. Rick exhaled slowly, the weight of everything he had learned settling into his chest, and for the first time he understood. This journey wasn't about finding something out there. It was about finding the connection within, with the world, with the energy that flowed through all things. He had crossed thresholds, yes, but the true threshold had always been inside him. The world wasn't waiting for him to arrive. It had been waiting for him to understand how to move within it, how to be part of it. He took a final, steadying breath and let the light of his realization fill him. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. And whatever came next, he was ready for it. Rick stood still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the light still lingering within him, as if it had fused with his very essence. The air around him no longer felt like an unknown expanse. It felt like home, like the world had unfolded in ways he hadn't fully understood before, but now in this moment seemed perfectly clear. The space around him pulsed softly, breathing in time with him, with his thoughts, with his choices. The stone, still glowing faintly in his hand, no longer felt like a separate entity. It was a part of him now, an extension of his understanding, his awareness. The path had always been there, but it wasn't about the destination anymore. It was about the journey and how he chose to walk it. The choices he had made had led him to this point, but they were not the end. They were simply markers, reflections of his deeper connection to the energy that flowed through everything. Rick felt a stirring deep within himself, a quiet pull that urged him forward, not into the unknown, but deeper into the truth of what he had become. The journey wasn't about mastery. It was about being, and with each step, each choice, he was creating the world around him. The space that had once felt distant and alien was now alive with possibility, and Rick understood that he was part of that flow. He wasn't just navigating this world, he was shaping it. As he began walking once more, the rhythm of the stone in his hand steadied, aligning with his every movement. The world around him seemed to shift with him, but not in a way that felt overwhelming. It was subtle, like the soft movement of wind through leaves, like the gentle ripples in water. With every step, the world bent to his will, but not in a forceful way. It felt natural, like he was coexisting with it, not against it. He didn't need to understand the intricacies of how it worked. He just had to trust that he was moving with it, in harmony. The space ahead was still vast, stretching out in every direction, but now Rick didn't feel lost. The light that had once felt like a distant guide now felt like a reflection of his own inner truth. It wasn't leading him, it was showing him, revealing the path that he had always been walking. He wasn't just a traveler in this space, he was an integral part of it, and with each choice the path before him would become clearer. The air shifted again, the soft pulse of energy growing stronger, vibrating with the rhythm of the world itself. Rick's steps were no longer tentative, no longer full of uncertainty. There was confidence in each movement now, a quiet assurance that had been building inside him since the moment he first picked up the stone. He wasn't just holding the stone anymore. He had become one with it, with the world, with the energy that ran through everything. Ahead, the light began to take on new forms, new shapes, patterns that Rick had seen before, but this time they were different. They weren't just symbols in the air anymore. They were living, breathing elements of the world around him, reflections of the choices he had made and the ones still to come. The symbols now moved in intricate designs, like the flow of water, like the pulse of the earth, a delicate balance that connected everything. The more Rick moved, the more the space around him shifted and responded, as if it too were becoming more aligned, more aware of his presence. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the space, the depth of the energy surrounding him. He understood now that this wasn't just about him. This was about everything. The interconnectedness of all things, the balance between choice and consequence, the space, the energy, the stone. It was all part of a greater whole, and Rick had become a part of that whole. The power he had felt, the transformation he had undergone, was not something that could be contained. It was something that had always been there, something that had been waiting for him to awaken it. And now, as Rick stood in the heart of it all, he knew that his role was not to dominate, not to control, but to create. The stone, the world around him, it was a reflection of his own inner potential. It was a canvas, a place where he could mold reality with every thought, every choice. But it wasn't just about power. It was about understanding, about balance. The choices he made now would shape not only his path, but the world around him. It was a responsibility, yes, but it was also a gift. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the energy flow through him. When he opened them again, the world around him had transformed. The path that had once seemed so uncertain was now a road he understood, a road he could walk with purpose. He was no longer just a wanderer in this vast space. He was its creator, its participant. And as he moved forward, the world around him began to shift in time with him. The symbols, the light, everything bending to the rhythm of his heart. The journey had never been about the stone, or the symbols, or even the space he had moved through. It had always been about understanding himself, about discovering the power within to shape the world around him. And now, with every step, Rick was creating that world, not just for himself, but for everything connected to him. He took another step, the stone still pulsing with warmth in his hand, and as he did, the path ahead stretched out before him, no longer uncertain, no longer a mystery. It was his path to walk, his journey to shape, and in that moment Rick understood that this was only the beginning. The world was alive, and he was part of it. Rick continued forward, each step solidifying his connection to the world around him. The space was no longer something foreign. It had become an extension of him, a mirror reflecting his inner transformation. The symbols that had once appeared as fleeting, incomprehensible patterns were now more than that. They were an integral part of his understanding. As he walked, they unfolded, expanding into forms and designs that spoke directly to his heart, each one a piece of his journey, each one resonating with the choices he had made. The pulse of the stone in his hand was steady, its warmth now something familiar, something that had become as natural as the rhythm of his own heart. It was no longer a separate thing. It was a reflection of his own awareness, a bridge between himself and the world, between his understanding and the energy that flowed through everything. He wasn't holding it. It was holding him, guiding him with each subtle thrum of energy. Ahead, the space began to shift again, but this time, it wasn't a dramatic change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the ebb and flow of the tide. The world around him seemed to breathe, responding to his movements, adjusting to his very presence. Rick felt the pull of something in the distance, something both familiar and new. It wasn't a figure this time, nor a symbol. It was simply a presence, something waiting for him, but not in a way that made him feel rushed or uncertain. It felt more like an invitation, a soft call to continue. Rick's steps grew more confident. He wasn't walking towards something to be discovered. He was walking towards something to be understood, a deeper connection to the energy that moved through everything. The symbols in the air had become clearer now, their forms shifting into complex geometries, intertwining in a way that made Rick feel that the very fabric of reality was being woven with each passing moment. He stopped again, feeling the hum of the space around him intensify, the air thicker, more vibrant, like every atom in the universe was holding its breath, waiting for his next decision. The stone in his hand pulsed once, then twice, each beat in rhythm with his heart, syncing with the energy that surrounded him. He understood now that this was the flow, the way the world, the universe, worked. It wasn't something to fight against. It was something to move with, to flow with. The energy, the patterns, the symbols, they were not separate from him. They were with him. The space around him seemed to open up, revealing more than what was visible at first glance. It was as if the world was expanding with him, stretching out in ways he hadn't yet anticipated. He didn't need to understand everything in this moment. It wasn't about knowing every detail. It was about trusting the process, trusting the flow, and most importantly, trusting himself. The pull in the distance became more pronounced. Rick felt it, a quiet tug deep inside him, like the soft whisper of a memory. He followed it instinctively, the stone guiding his movements as much as his own intuition. It wasn't a destination he was walking toward, not in the traditional sense. It was an understanding, a place where the world and his place in it would converge into something whole. As he continued, the energy around him shifted again, this time with more intensity. The world before him seemed to bend and fold, but in a way that felt organic, natural. It was like a new layer of reality was unfolding, and Rick could feel himself moving with it, not as a passive participant, but as a creator, as someone whose very presence was helping to shape what came next. The stone pulsed again, its glow intensifying for a moment, and with it Rick felt a deeper connection, a deeper understanding that transcended words. It wasn't knowledge he was after anymore. It was being a part of the world, with the world. The space ahead of him became clearer, and in the distance, Rick saw a faint light, soft, glowing, and steady. It was not an external light, not something that had to be reached. It was something that was already within him, a reflection of his own inner growth. As he approached it, he felt the warmth of it fill him, not as a source outside of him, but as something he had unlocked within himself. He stopped, standing at the edge of the light, feeling the energy around him pulse softly, almost as if the world itself was waiting. And then, in a deep, steadying breath, Rick understood. The light wasn't something he had to reach for. It wasn't something he had to strive for. It was his, already within him, already a part of his journey. This wasn't a moment to chase. It was a moment to embrace, to step into, to be fully present with. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, the energy within it aligning with the energy around him. He raised it higher, not to control but to join. The light around him grew brighter, not because it was something new, but because it had always been there. And now, as Rick stood in the center of it, he realized that this was the culmination of everything. His journey, his choices, his transformation. He had crossed every threshold not to find the answers, but to become one with them, to integrate them into his being. Rick didn't need to understand the exact mechanics of it all. He didn't need to force anything into place. The light, the energy, the stone, and the universe around him, it was all part of him, and he was part of it. He was no longer a traveler seeking his way. He was a creator, shaping the world with every breath, every choice. The light around him faded softly, not disappearing but becoming a part of him, a part of the world. The path ahead, the next steps, were not defined in any concrete way, but Rick knew he was no longer just walking. He was moving with purpose, with understanding, and with the world itself. Whatever came next, he was ready. Rick stood in the quiet after the light faded, feeling the energy around him settle into a soft hum. It wasn't a silence, not really. It was more like a pause, the space before the next chapter of the journey. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he could feel it, the subtle pull of the next step, the path that would open as naturally as the last one had. The stone still rested in his hand, its warmth constant and steady, a reminder that the connection between him and the world was not just about the journey, but about how he walked it. The space around him had changed again, but this time it wasn't a shift, a sudden twist. It felt more like a deep breath, the world exhaling after a long, steady inhale. The glow from the light had faded, but it hadn't disappeared. It was within him now, an energy that resonated in every part of his being. The sense of connection, of alignment, was clearer than ever, and Rick understood, without fully knowing how, that this was the moment of synthesis. Everything that had come before, the forest, the stone, the symbols, had been leading him here, but not just to a place. They had led him to a state of being, a realization that he was not merely walking through the world, but that he was part of it, a vital part of the energy that moved through everything. The universe, the space, the light. It was not something to conquer or control. It was something to move with, to exist within. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet flow over him. He didn't feel lost anymore. The uncertainty that had once filled him, the questions that had seemed so overwhelming, had all fallen away. There was no need to rush toward the future, no need to force anything into being. The world wasn't something to be mastered, it was something to become part of. And in that quiet realization, Rick felt something shift within him deep inside. When he opened his eyes again, the space around him was still vast, but now it felt open rather than infinite. There were no barriers, no edges. The road ahead didn't stretch into the unknown. It was already there, waiting for him to take the next step. The symbols, the light, the energy, everything that had been guiding him was still present, but now it felt like a natural part of the world. Not a guide, not a force to be reckoned with, but an extension of his own presence in the space. He was no longer trying to figure it out. He was just in it. Rick took a deep breath, his chest rising with the quiet certainty of his understanding. The stone in his hand pulsed gently, and he held it for a moment, letting the warmth spread through him. He wasn't holding it to find answers anymore. He was holding it because it was a part of him now, a piece of his own journey, a tool that had helped him understand something far greater than any external force could provide. As he moved forward, the space around him responded to his steps in the softest way. There was no dramatic unfolding, no sudden appearance of new symbols or visions. Instead, the space adapted to his movement, subtly shifting to accommodate his choices, Each step felt more fluid, more natural, as though the very act of moving through it was an expression of his understanding. The world didn't need to make sense in the traditional way. It had already revealed itself to him in its quiet, steady rhythm, and now Rick was simply part of that rhythm. He could feel the pulse of the stone in his hand, but it was no longer a call to action. It was a part of the steady beat of the universe, reminding him that everything he had learned, everything he had discovered, was simply a reflection of the truth he had always known. There was no need to chase after answers anymore. The answers were within him, in the choices he made, in the way he moved through the world. The space around him, the flow of energy, was not something to manipulate or control. It was something to walk with, to live in. The next step was still there waiting for him, but now it felt less like a destination and more like a continuation of the same energy that had been guiding him all along. It wasn't about reaching some final conclusion. It was about moving forward, with the world, with the energy, with the stone, and with himself. Rick took that next step, not with hesitation, but with the quiet confidence of someone who understood. The path was not something to be figured out, it was something to live. Each step, each choice was part of the journey, not a separate, distinct moment. It was all interconnected, all part of the flow that he had tapped into. The world seemed to breathe with him, not apart from him. The patterns of energy around him weren't external forces guiding him. They were his own, living within him, pulsing, with the rhythm of his steps, the steady beat of his heart. He wasn't searching for meaning, he had already found it. The stone, the symbols, the light. They had all been a means of unlocking the truth that had always been inside him. Rick moved forward, the path ahead more clear than it had ever been. It wasn't a road to be conquered. It was a road to be walked, to be lived, to be created. Every step he took was his own, part of the world, part of the energy that flowed through everything. And as he walked, he didn't need to look ahead. He simply moved, trusting that the next step would reveal itself in its own time. The world was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a dance, a rhythm, a place where he was both the traveler and the path. As he walked forward, the stone still warm in his hand, Rick felt a deep, quiet peace settle within him. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. And whatever came next, he was ready. Rick moved deeper into the space, each step flowing with a natural rhythm, as though the world around him had found its own beat, syncing with his every motion. The air felt lighter now, freer, as if the weight of the journey had been released and replaced by an openness, a fluidity that allowed him to simply be. The stone in his hand pulsed with a steady hum, not pushing him forward, but merely accompanying him, a gentle reminder that everything he needed was already within him. He no longer felt the pressure of uncertainty or the need for answers. The world around him was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was an experience, a continuous unfolding that he was both part of and shaping with every movement, every thought. The path before him was not a destination, but a journey that existed in the very act of walking, in the very act of choosing to move forward. And as he walked, the energy around him seemed to shift in time with his choices, becoming a reflection of his own understanding, his own growth. There were no walls here, no boundaries. The space seemed infinite, but not in a way that overwhelmed him. It was as though the universe itself was stretching out, waiting for him to step into it, to explore it in his own way, at his own pace. He didn't need to understand it all right now. He only needed to trust that it was his to experience, to shape. The stone, warm and pulsing in his hand, felt like an extension of his own energy, guiding him not with force but with quiet assurance. The light around him softened and deepened, no longer a glaring beacon but a gentle presence, as if the universe itself was embracing him, waiting for him to fully accept his place within it. The symbols in the air, the intricate patterns that had once seemed so complex, had faded into a soft, swirling glow. They weren't gone. They were simply integrated, woven into the fabric of the space, a part of the world he had become a part of. Rick's thoughts were clear now. He wasn't searching anymore. The questions that had once consumed him, questions about the stone, the journey, the world, no longer seemed important. They were part of the process, part of the unfolding. but they were not the end. He had found the answers not through discovery, but through understanding. The universe had always been in balance. It had always been waiting for him to step into it fully, to realize his connection to it. And now, with each step, he was doing just that. Ahead, the space began to shift again. But this time, it wasn't a dramatic change. It was subtle. A quiet expansion of the world around him, as if the universe itself was responding to his presence, to his understanding. The air grew warmer, softer, and as he moved forward, Rick felt the pulse of the stone in his hand align with the rhythm of the world. It was no longer a tool to guide him. It was simply a part of him, a reflection of the flow of energy that ran through everything. He stopped for a moment, feeling the steady hum of the stone, and the world around him seemed to pause with him, like a deep breath taken by the universe itself. And in that moment of stillness, Rick understood something deeper. This journey, this space, had never been about the stone, or the path, or the choices he had made. It had always been about becoming aware of his place within it all, about recognizing that he was not separate from the world. He was part of it. He had always been part of it. The world wasn't a place to be navigated. It was a world to be experienced, to be lived. The light around him shifted again, but this time it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't a beacon, a guiding light. It was a soft, comforting glow, a reminder that everything was exactly as it should be. There was no need to rush toward the next step. There was no destination to reach. The journey had never been about reaching the end. It had always been about walking, breathing, and living in the moment. And Rick realized in that moment that he was no longer trying to find something. He was simply being. He was part of the flow, part of the energy, part of the world. And just as the world had shifted with his every step, he understood now that the next phase of his journey wouldn't be about moving forward, but about existing within the moment. He didn't need to force anything. He didn't need to chase anything. The answers, the growth, the understanding, it had all been within him. It was always within him. He simply had to trust it. Rick exhaled slowly, his chest rising with the calm certainty of his realization. The journey hadn't been about discovering new truths. It had been about unveiling the truths that had always been there. The world had been waiting for him, not to conquer it, but to be with it. And now, as he stood in the center of it all, he felt a profound peace settle within him. The world around him no longer seemed vast and mysterious. It was familiar, intimate, like a home he had always known. And now, he was fully present within it. The symbols that had once seemed like distant guides were now part of him, like threads woven into the fabric of his own being. There was no longer any uncertainty. There was only the flow, the steady rhythm of the universe, of the energy that connected all things. Rick didn't need to ask what came next. He didn't need to chase any further answers. He simply needed to exist, to be. And with that understanding, Rick took the next step, not toward some far-off destination, but into the heart of the moment, into the now. Rick's feet moved with the same steady rhythm, no longer a search for answers or a race toward an unknown future. He wasn't moving towards something out there. He was simply moving with the flow of the world, with the pulse of the universe that now felt as much a part of him as the steady beat of his heart. Every step felt natural, like he was walking through his own thoughts, through his own understanding, each footfall aligning with the energy around him, flowing with it rather than against it. The space around him had become more tangible, more intimate. It was no longer an abstract idea, an empty expanse waiting to be filled. It was a living, breathing thing, just as alive as he was. The light had softened once again, no longer blinding or overwhelming, but gentle, like the last rays of a sunset, casting long shadows across a familiar landscape. The symbols, the patterns, they were no longer separate entities or things to be deciphered. They were simply there, like the lines of a familiar song woven into the fabric of the world. There, meanings embedded in every movement, every choice he made. As Rick walked, the path before him shifted, but not in a way that startled or confused him. The ground beneath his feet was solid, the energy around him stable, yet there was a fluidity to it, an ease that made everything feel natural, as if the very act of walking was enough to keep the world in motion. There were no sudden changes, no jarring shifts, only a slow, continuous unfolding. It was as though he had entered a state of perfect harmony with the space he inhabited, with the energy that surrounded him, and with the rhythm of his own being. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, but it wasn't a call to action. It was simply a confirmation, a steady reminder of the connection he had forged with it. It was no longer just an object, a tool that had guided him through this journey. It had become an extension of his awareness, a reminder that everything he had learned, everything he had come to understand, was already inside him. The stone was not a key to some distant answer. It was a symbol of the truth he had unlocked within himself. Rick stopped for a moment, letting the steady hum of the stone fill him, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. There was no more urgency, no more need to rush. He wasn't trying to find something, he was simply existing within it. The flow of energy around him continued, subtle and steady, like a gentle stream that had always been there, waiting for him to notice it, to step into it. The world wasn't pushing him forward anymore. He was moving with it in perfect sync, each step taken in complete harmony with everything that had come before it. In the distance, he could see the faintest glimmer, but it wasn't a beacon, a guide to something beyond. It was simply a reflection of the world he had entered, of the peace he had found. There was no external destination to reach, no goal to be achieved. The world, the space around him, had already shifted into place. It was not a place to conquer. It was a place to live within, to be with. The light, the energy, everything around him. It was simply part of the journey, part of the existence that was unfolding with every passing moment. Rick could feel the world around him adjust to his presence, but it wasn't a forceful adjustment. It was a subtle, natural shift, as if the space itself was breathing with him, flowing with him, becoming more aligned with each choice he made. The symbols, the patterns, the glowing light, they were not things to chase or seek. They were simply the world, reflecting the choices he made, the steps he took, the energy he moved with. He didn't need to understand everything in this moment. The understanding was already there. The knowledge, the clarity, it was already inside him. He had unlocked it, not through effort, but through being. There was no need to struggle or search. The world had always been in perfect balance. It had been waiting for him to align with it, to step into it, to simply exist within it. Rick took another step, and this time, the space around him didn't shift dramatically. It simply flowed with him, as if the very ground beneath him was alive with the choices he had made, with the understanding he had gained. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, not with urgency, but with quiet confirmation. He wasn't lost anymore. He wasn't searching for something external. He was simply walking through a world that he had become one with. The space ahead of him wasn't a destination. It was an experience. It was life, unfolding with each breath, with each step. There was no end to this journey. There was only the ongoing unfolding of understanding, the continual dance with the world. And in that moment, Rick understood that there was no need to define the path, to impose an ending. The journey itself was the destination. The path he walked was not separate from him. It was him, and everything around him was simply a reflection of that. Rick's steps were steady now, each one grounded in the quiet certainty that had grown within him. The energy around him continued to hum, not with urgency, but with peace. The world was alive, not with chaos, but with potential. And Rick knew now, without any doubt, that this was the way forward. Not to control the world, but to live with it, to exist within it, to be part of it. There was no need to hurry, no need to rush. The journey would unfold as it would, and Rick was ready to walk it step by step, breathing in the rhythm of the universe, flowing with its energy, becoming one with it. Rick's movements were fluid now, as though every step was in perfect alignment with the world around him. There was no longer any sense of resistance, no striving towards something beyond the moment. It was as though the journey itself had become the destination, and he was simply walking in sync with it, one step after another, without urgency, without doubt. Each footfall seemed to echo with the quiet certainty that everything had led to this. He was here, fully present in the unfolding, moving with the rhythm of the universe. The world around him felt less like a place to be navigated and more like a companion, walking beside him, breathing in time with him. The symbols that had once been a guide, a map to his path, had faded into the background, becoming a part of the landscape of his mind. They were no longer separate from him. They were simply the language of the world he had entered, the language of his own consciousness, and it was a language he now understood deeply. There were no more questions. The search for meaning had ceased because he had become part of that meaning. The answers were no longer something to be found, they were something to live. He could feel the stone in his hand, its pulse a steady beat against his skin, but it no longer felt like an object he held. It was simply him, as much a part of him as his breath, as his heart, as his thoughts. The stone had been a catalyst, a tool, but its purpose had long since been fulfilled. Now, it was just a reflection of the deeper truth he had uncovered. Rick didn't need to chase after anything. He wasn't seeking the next revelation, the next transformation. It was all here, in this moment, in the steady rhythm of his movements, in the deep silence that surrounded him. The world around him was alive, and he was a part of it. He had always been a part of it. The journey had never been about crossing thresholds or reaching some far-off goal. It had been about coming to understand that everything was interconnected, that the world he had been searching for was inside him all along. The space ahead was no longer an unknown. It wasn't a place to be explored, but a space to be in. It had always been there, waiting for him to step into it fully. And now, as he continued forward, Rick realized that there was no line between him and the world anymore. He had become one with it, moving in rhythm with its energy, no longer a separate entity but part of the ongoing flow of existence. As Rick walked, the light around him softened, not fading but deepening, like the world was wrapping itself around him in a gentle embrace. He felt no need to understand the mechanics of it all. He didn't need to analyze or question. He simply was, and that was enough. The universe wasn't something he had to dominate or conquer. It was something he had to exist within, to flow with, and in that flowing he had found peace. The path before him seemed endless, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was expansive in the most peaceful way, like a horizon that stretched on forever. Yet it didn't feel like a distance to be covered. It felt like a space to be experienced, to be lived in. The road had never been about finding the end. It was about experiencing the journey, the subtle shifts of energy, the quiet revelations that came with each step. Rick no longer needed a destination. The journey itself was the reward. The stone in his hand pulsed one last time, but this time it wasn't a signal, it wasn't an invitation. It was simply a confirmation, a recognition of the unity between him and everything around him. It was as though the stone had fulfilled its purpose, had guided him to this point, and now it was simply a companion, steady and constant, a reflection of the peace that had settled deep within him. Rick looked up, and for the first time, he saw the world not as a puzzle, not as something to be figured out, but as something to be experienced. He didn't need to seek any further. He didn't need to chase any more answers. The answers were all around him, woven into the very fabric of the world. The beauty was in the living, in the being, in the quiet understanding that he was already part of it. The light continued to glow, not bright and blinding, but soft and steady, like the fading light of dusk, filling the space with a sense of calm and resolution. There was no final revelation waiting for him. The revelation had already happened. It had happened when he stepped into the flow of the world, when he realized that he wasn't separate from it. The journey was never about discovery, it was about being. With each breath, Rick felt himself moving deeper into this understanding, deeper into the quiet truth that had always been there, just waiting for him to see it. The world around him wasn't a puzzle, it wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was simply life, unfolding in the most natural, beautiful way, and he was part of it, as much a part of the energy that flowed through everything as the stone that had guided him here. Rick continued to walk, not toward a goal, not toward an answer, but simply in the rhythm of existence. Every step felt natural, every breath a reminder that he was not searching. He was simply here, and that was all he needed to be. The world was not waiting for him to find something. It was simply waiting for him to live, and in that living he had found everything he needed. Rick's steps continued, slow and deliberate, each one grounding him deeper into the rhythm of the world. The space around him felt familiar now, not because it was something he recognized, but because it had become a reflection of his own inner transformation. The light, the energy, everything around him had merged into a quiet, steady hum that pulsed with the same beat as his heart. There was no need to push forward anymore, no need to chase after the next thing. He wasn't moving toward a destination. He was simply living within the flow of existence, and in doing so he had found the peace he had been searching for. The air around him was warm, but not stifling. It was the kind of warmth that embraced you, the kind that made you feel like you belonged. It was the same feeling he had first experienced when he had stepped into this space, this sense that everything was waiting for him, that it was his to experience. And now that sense was more vivid than ever. The universe was not an overwhelming force, but a quiet companion, moving with him, breathing with him, in perfect harmony. As Rick moved forward, he noticed how the world around him continued to shift, but again it wasn't with the dramatic intensity of earlier moments. The changes were subtle now, soft and natural, like the wind shaping the land over time. The symbols in the air, the glowing patterns, they no longer felt like markers or guides. They felt like part of the landscape, part of the fabric of reality itself. There was no longer any need to understand them. They simply were as everything simply was. He had learned to move through it all without needing to label, without needing to define. The world was both known and unknown, and in that space there was a peaceful freedom. Rick paused for a moment, letting the quiet energy wash over him. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to figure out. The journey, in a sense, had reached its end, but it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like a moment of total immersion, where everything was aligned, and he was no longer separated from it. There was no destination ahead of him, no end waiting for him to arrive. The road wasn't something to travel, it was something to live. He looked up at the sky, though there were no stars, no moon to guide him. Instead, the space above was filled with a soft, gentle glow that seemed to shift and move, as if it were breathing with him. The light wasn't external anymore. It was part of him, part of the world around him, part of the connection that tied everything together. In that moment, he realized that the world had never been something to find or possess. It had always been about existing within it, moving with it, breathing with it. A calm understanding settled within him, deeper than before. The stone in his hand was still there, warm and steady, but it no longer felt like something he held. It felt like an extension of himself, like a memory of a past he had now outgrown. He didn't need it anymore to understand the rhythm of the universe. It had served its purpose, not as an object of power, but as a tool for awakening, a symbol of the deeper truth that had always been waiting for him to see. As he continued walking, the path ahead stretched endlessly, but there was no hurry. There was no longer a need to rush to the next moment. The truth of the world was not something to chase, something to possess. It was something to live. And in living it, he understood that he was both the creator and the creation. He was a part of this world, and this world was a part of him. He stepped forward again, and this time, the space around him didn't respond with anything dramatic, nothing overwhelming. It simply embraced him softly, warmly. It was as if everything around him was acknowledging him, not as a separate entity, but as part of the flow, part of the dance of existence. He no longer felt like he was moving towards something. He was simply moving. The light in the distance, once so far, now seemed to grow more intimate, not a beacon to reach, but an ever-present reflection of the truth that had been unlocked within him. The world wasn't about achieving, about reaching some distant goal. It was about understanding the energy that flowed through everything, the connection between all things. Rick wasn't just a traveler anymore. He was part of the journey itself, and in that realization he understood that the journey never ended. It only continued, like the ebb and flow of the tide, like the beating of a heart. Rick didn't need to understand every moment. He didn't need to grasp for meaning. He already was part of the meaning. Every step, every choice was enough. He had become part of the world he had been searching for, and there was peace in that realization. The world wasn't a place to be conquered. It was a place to live in, to exist within, to shape with every breath, every thought, every moment of understanding. The stone still pulsed in his hand, but now it was simply a reminder of how far he had come, not in distance but in understanding. The path ahead, though infinite, didn't feel like a journey to be completed. It was a journey to be lived, and Rick was ready to live it. He breathed deeply, the air warm and full of life, and he knew in that stillness that the universe had already welcomed him. It was no longer something to be explored. It was something to exist within. And with that he stepped forward, not toward something external, but into the world as part of it, living in harmony with the ever-unfolding flow of the universe. As Rick continued forward, there was no immediate change in the world around him, yet everything felt subtly different. The stillness he had become so familiar with now felt like a vast, quiet space brimming with potential. He no longer had to reach for the next moment. He was already living it. The pulse of the stone in his hand still beat steadily, its rhythm no longer something he sought, but something that flowed through him, synchronizing with the world as if it had always been part of him. Each step he took was not just a step on a path, but an invitation to exist fully in the present, to be with the world in the most authentic way possible. The energy around him, once a distant abstract force, now felt like a living thing, a companion, one that moved with him, alongside him, as if the space itself was listening and responding to his every choice. Rick's every movement seemed to weave with the very fabric of existence, in tune with the pulse that had become second nature to him. The air around him was still warm, but now it wasn't merely warm with the light of the world. It was warm with the understanding he had unlocked. The world didn't feel like something outside him anymore. It felt like an extension of himself, an integral part of his journey. There was no longer a divide between the space around him and the space within. They were one. He felt no pressure to move faster or slower, no urgency to chase after anything. He simply existed, walking with the flow, moving as naturally as the air around him. The questions he had once carried had dissolved into the quiet certainty that all of this, his journey, his life, his understanding, was unfolding exactly as it should. Every step he took was an expression of his own being, an embodiment of everything he had become. Rick stopped for a moment, taking in the stillness around him. He didn't need to understand it all. He didn't need to analyze. The answers he had sought for so long had never been external. They had always been inside him, waiting to be unlocked, to be realized. The stone in his hand was no longer a tool to find something. It was a symbol of his connection to the world, a reminder that he was a part of it, and it was a part of him. Looking up, he saw that the light ahead had changed, not in intensity, but in its quality. It wasn't a guiding light anymore. It was a reflection of his own inner peace, his inner certainty. The light wasn't something to be reached. It was something to be lived in, something to be embodied. It had always been there, but it was only now, in this moment, that Rick truly understood that it wasn't a destination to seek. It was a presence to inhabit. With this understanding came a calm acceptance. The path ahead was not something to figure out or chase after. It was a path to be with. Rick wasn't searching for answers. He was simply existing, moving with the flow of the universe, letting it unfold around him. The world was not something to control or master. It was something to move with, to live within, to shape with every breath, every choice, every step. The stone, still warm in his hand, pulsed again, but this time the pulse wasn't urging him forward. It was a reminder, a soft, steady rhythm that anchored him to the present. He was not apart from the world. He was part of it. And in this realization, there was a deep peace, a quiet certainty that all was as it should be. Rick continued walking, the path before him stretching into the distance, but it no longer felt like a road to be traveled. It felt like a world to be lived within, to be shaped with each step, each breath. There was no longer a need to rush, no destination to reach. He had found what he had been searching for, not in a place, but in the act of being. The journey was not about finding answers. It was about living with the questions, existing within the flow of the world and understanding that the answers were not something outside him. They were a part of him, woven into every step, every thought, every choice he made. As he moved, Rick felt a deep sense of connection to the world around him, to the energy that flowed through everything. It was not a force to be mastered, but a dance to be moved with. And in that dance, Rick had found peace. He had become part of the rhythm, part of the flow. There was no more need to seek. There was only the living, the breathing, the being. And that, Rick realized, was enough. The world around him seemed to soften, to breathe with him, and he knew without a doubt that this was his place. The journey wasn't over, but it was no longer something to be struggled through. It was something to be experienced, to be lived. And as he moved forward, Rick knew he had found the truth he had been searching for. Not out there, not in the world around him, but within himself. And in that truth, there was peace. The space around him seemed to shimmer with an energy that wasn't separate from him. It was his. It was ours. He was a part of everything, and everything was a part of him. And in this understanding, he took another step forward, not in search of something, but simply because that was what he was meant to do. Rick's steps slowed, but they didn't stop. The path before him, though vast, didn't seem as daunting anymore. It wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about being fully present in each moment, each step. The light around him continued to shift softly, glowing in a way that felt as though it was not just illuminating the path ahead, but filling it with meaning. It wasn't a place to be figured out or understood in the traditional sense. It was a world to be experienced, one slow breath at a time. The stone, warm and steady in his hand, had become so much more than a tool. It was a part of him, but not in the way he had once thought. It didn't guide him the way he had imagined it would. It was simply a reflection of his connection to the world, an anchor to the present. The world around him no longer felt foreign or separate. It felt like an extension of his own thoughts, his own being. There was no urgency in his movements now, no desire to race towards something or to reach an end. The universe had always been moving with him, around him, and within him. His journey was no longer one of searching, but of being, of living with the flow of everything that surrounded him. It was as though he had always known this, but it was only now, in this moment, that he was fully aware of it. The air felt different now, too. The weight of it, the rhythm of it, all seemed to match the flow of his thoughts. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was light, gentle, and constant, like a soft wind at his back, pushing him forward, not with force but with quiet support. He didn't need to question where he was going. There was no more need for questions. There was only the knowing that each step he took was exactly the step he was meant to take. Rick stopped again, his gaze drifting across the space before him. It wasn't as though he had arrived at a new place. It was more like he had stepped fully into the place he had always been. The patterns, the energy, the symbols that had once been so distant, so fragmented, were now a part of the whole. There was no separation between him and the universe anymore. He had become part of the cycle, part of the dance, part of the energy that moved through everything. And yet there was still so much to explore, so much to discover, but this exploration was no longer driven by the need to find answers. It was driven by the desire to simply be in the moment, to live it fully and without hesitation. The answers would come, not in flashes of insight or grand revelations, but in the quiet unfolding of each day, of each step, of each choice. Rick felt the stone pulse again, but this time there was no urgency in its rhythm. It was simply a steady, calming beat, a reminder that the flow of the world was constant and unyielding, and he was part of that flow. He always had been. He took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment fill him, and he began walking again. The path ahead seemed endless, but in the most peaceful way. There was no rush to reach it, no need to rush ahead. He could feel the world around him responding to his movements, not with change, but with affirmation. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was in harmony with the world he now fully understood. It wasn't about seeking meaning anymore. The meaning was already here. in every step, in every moment. The journey had never been about finding something outside of himself. It had always been about finding the truth that was already inside him, and in doing so, realizing that he was not separate from the world. He was part of it. He had always been. The space around him shimmered softly, the energy vibrating with the same pulse as his heartbeat, and he understood. The world wasn't something to be fixed or changed. It wasn't something that needed to be controlled or mastered. It was something to be lived, and in living it he had found the peace that had always eluded him. As Rick moved forward, he realized that he was no longer seeking a new revelation. He was simply embracing the one he had already received, that the world, the universe, and his place within it were not things to be conquered. They were things to be lived within, to exist with, to be a part of. There was no need for further questions. The answers were already woven into the very fabric of his being. The space ahead of him no longer felt like a road to be walked. It felt like a life to be lived, fully and completely as part of the flow, as part of the energy that moved through him, through everything, through all things. The stone in his hand pulsed once more, but now it was less of a reminder and more of a confirmation. A confirmation that he had arrived, not at an end, but at a place where everything had come full circle. There was no more seeking. There was only being. Rick walked forward with steady steps, each one grounding him deeper into the rhythm of the world, the universe. He was not an observer of it anymore. He was a part of it, moving in harmony with it, flowing with it. The path ahead, though infinite, no longer felt like a destination to be reached. It was simply the next step in the journey of being, and with each step he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. With each step, Rick felt the world around him deepen, not in complexity, but in connection. The path beneath his feet, the space above him, the soft glow that surrounded him, everything seemed to expand, not outward, but inward. It wasn't as though the world was growing or changing. It was as if he was becoming more attuned to it, more deeply immersed in its rhythm, in its hum. He had once thought that understanding the world meant unraveling its mysteries, but now he knew it wasn't about unraveling at all. It was about being part of the fabric, part of the flow that moved through all things, part of the grand eternal dance. The stone in his hand still pulsed with a gentle warmth, but its significance had changed. It was no longer a symbol of something to be gained or mastered. It had become a companion, a reminder of the journey he had already completed, and of the ongoing journey of being that would unfold before him with each passing moment. It wasn't an external force. It was a reflection of his own inner harmony, the connection between himself and the world. He no longer needed to question the path ahead. He knew now that the journey wasn't about moving forward to some distant end. It was about being fully present in each moment, each step, and letting the universe move with him. The air felt warmer now, as though the space had absorbed him, wrapped him in its quiet embrace. The light around him continued to shift, but it wasn't a dramatic change. It was more like a deepening, a softening of the world's edges, a blending of light and shadow, of certainty and mystery. He could see now, with a clarity that came not from the mind, but from the soul, that the light wasn't something outside of him. It was something he carried with him. The light was within him, an extension of his own energy, his own understanding of the world. Rick didn't need to search for meaning anymore. He had stopped searching a long time ago. Meaning wasn't something that could be found. It was something that emerged when he aligned himself with the flow of life, with the energy that moved through all things. Every step he took now was an expression of that alignment. The path didn't stretch endlessly in front of him. It simply was, existing fully in the moment. And with each moment, he knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. His feet continued, moving, not out of necessity, but out of the quiet understanding that every step was a part of the unfolding. The space around him responded with a soft, almost imperceptible shift, not in the form of change, but in the form of harmony, as though the world around him was settling into place with each movement, each breath. The air was still but full of life, full of connection. Rick could feel it deep within him, the energy that ran through everything, that flowed through him, that connected him to the universe. There was no separation anymore. He was no longer just a part of the world. He was the world. The stone pulsed again, its warmth steady and constant. It wasn't calling him forward anymore. It was simply a reflection of his own pulse, his own rhythm, a reminder that he had become one with the flow of the universe. There was nothing more to be achieved, nothing more to discover in the traditional sense. What was left now was simply the act of being, of moving with the energy that had always been there, of living in harmony with the rhythms of the world. Rick stopped again, this time not out of necessity, but simply because he was present with the moment. There was no rush to get anywhere. There was no destination, no goal. The journey itself was the destination. He had reached a place where the journey had become the living, breathing experience of being. There was peace in that. He didn't need to know what the next step would bring. He didn't need to understand it. He simply needed to be with it. As he stood there, he realized that the path ahead, though invisible, was already clear. It was clear because he had come to understand that there was no path to follow, no road to walk. There was only the world, to live in, to move through, to create with. The world had never been something to be controlled. It had always been something to move with, to flow through. And now, Rick was part of that flow, a living, breathing part of the energy that moved through everything. He wasn't the master of it. He wasn't the observer. He was the experience itself, the unfolding of the world, the living rhythm of existence. The air around him shimmered with a quiet energy, the light soft and constant, like the first light of dawn stretching over the horizon. There was no need to see what lay beyond the light. He didn't need to know. He knew now that it wasn't about seeing the future, but about living fully in the present, fully in the light of his own awareness. Rick took a final breath, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, the pulse of the world, and he knew, without a doubt, that the journey had always been about this moment. Not an end, but a beginning. Not a destination, but a living, breathing process. And with that he continued forward, not searching, but living, moving with the flow, with the universe, with the energy of all things. Rick's steps were measured now, no longer driven by the urgency to reach somewhere, but by the quiet awareness that he was exactly where he needed to be. The world around him continued to flow, not changing, not shifting, but settling into a deep, resonant calm that he could feel in every cell of his being. The space, the energy, had become an extension of himself, each moment blending seamlessly with the next, like the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heart that had always been beating. The stone in his hand still pulsed, but it was no longer something to be held. It was simply there, an extension of his understanding, a reflection of the harmony he had found within himself. There were no questions left, no more searching. The journey had never been about finding answers. It had always been about understanding the flow of life, the ebb and pull of energy, the constant dance of existence. It was never about mastery. It was always about being in tune with the world, in sync with the rhythm of everything that moved. And now, standing in the center of it all, Rick understood that the world had always been here, waiting for him to step into it fully, to stop seeking, to stop trying to control, and simply live within it. The air around him was still, but full of life. The light had softened again, no longer harsh or blinding, but gentle and pervasive, like the first rays of dawn that spread across the sky, filling everything with a quiet, steady glow. There was no need to move faster or slower. The moment was perfect, just as it was, and Rick was simply living in it, each breath, each step, an expression of the flow he had become part of. Rick didn't need to see the end anymore. He didn't need to know what came next. The understanding he had gained, the realization that everything was connected, that there was no true separation between him and the world, was enough. The light ahead, once something to strive for, had become a reflection of his own inner peace. It wasn't something to chase. It was something to be with, something to be. He paused, allowing the stillness to envelop him, the quiet hum of the universe, resonating in his chest, in his mind. There was no need to move forward with haste, no destination that awaited him. The journey had never been about the path. It had been about how he chose to walk it. And now, Rick understood that the real destination had always been within. He had always been part of the world, not separate from it. He had only needed to see it, to feel it, to accept that he was with it. The stone pulsed gently again, but there was no urgency in the rhythm, no need for action. It was simply an acknowledgement of his place within the universe, a steady reminder that he was part of the flow, that the journey was never about getting to the end. It was about being in the moment, existing within the world, living through it with it as it. Rick took another step forward, but this time it wasn't to reach somewhere. It was simply a continuation of the same quiet rhythm, a movement within the flow that had always been there. The world around him responded, not with change, but with a deep sense of alignment, like everything had always been moving toward this moment, toward the realization that there was no destination to reach. The world was not a place to arrive. It was a journey to live within, and Rick was already living it. With each breath, with each step, the energy around him deepened, but it didn't change. It wasn't a force pulling him in one direction or another. It was simply the essence of being, and as he moved through it, it moved with him, breathing in time with his own pulse, with his own thoughts. There was no separation. There was no push, no pull. There was only the quiet understanding that he was part of it all. The space, the world, the universe. It was not something to be figured out. It was something to be lived with. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the energy around him swirl gently, like a soft breeze against his skin. And in that moment, he realized that the journey had never been about finding something outside of him. It had been about discovering the truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. He had never been lost. He had always been exactly where he needed to be. When he opened his eyes again, the world didn't look different, but it felt different. It felt whole, not in a way that could be explained, but in a way that resonated with the quiet truth he had uncovered. The space, the air, the energy around him, they were no longer separate. They were part of him, and he was part of them. There was no longer a need to question or search. There was only the experience of being, of existing in the flow, of living. With the rhythm of the world, Rick took another deep breath, letting the peace of the moment fill him, and with that, he understood. The journey wasn't over. It had never been about an end. It had been about the living, the being, and in that realization, there was no final destination. There was only the unfolding of existence, the quiet rhythm of the world, and Rick moving with it, one step at a time, breathing, living being,